You are listening to Cemetery Confessions, the world's #1 goth talk podcast.
Hello and welcome back to Cemetery Confessions. I don't know about you, but for me and my family and a lot of my friends, autumnal Halloween traditions are in full swing. In fact, I'm actually contributing to a piece on the Halloween season for Auxiliary Magazine for their fall issue, which will be out in a month or so. But I hope that you, dear listener, are finding time to enjoy a seasonal beverage and visit your local pumpkin patch with those closest to you. Speaking of treats, I thought I should mention that the Belfry app is back on the Android store. I actually didn't realize it was gone in the first place, but if you want an easy way to access Cemetery Confessions and all the other podcasts on the network, that is a great way to do it. So you just go to the Android Play Store and search for the Belfry Network and give it a download. But this show itself is also filled with ghoulish delights. Our guest this month is KB. They run the YouTube channel Goth Music Latin America, where they review and share information about bands from across Latin America. For example, they just did a great series of videos on the history of Peruvian goth music. But they also have a Tumblr and Facebook page full of new releases off of Bandcamp. So if you're looking for new bands to listen to, it's a great resource to check out. What we've done for this episode is something completely different. We're going to be talking about eras of goth gone by through the vehicle of 6 albums that we've pre-selected. So we'll be listening to these albums with you and sharing personal anecdotes about our time in the goth scene and our time discovering these albums. And we'll be talking about the music and how it's had an impact on goth culture and the music of the scene at the time more broadly, and its impact on goth culture more broadly. In addition to that, supplanting our Sinister Suggestions segment, this episode we have a new segment called All Goth Considered. And this is featuring and put together by the incredible Azzy of Obscura Undead. They've interviewed Vandal Moon, Vision Video, and Pilgrims of Yearning to talk about their newest music releases and a few other things, so you should absolutely stick around for that gorgeous segment. But without further ado, I am your host, Danny Ashes. I'm here with your other host, Trey, and KB, of course. So why don't we start by getting some information about our guest? I always like to start by asking the guest how they got into goth, where that started, whether that was goth or something else, and how that transition happened for you.
Okay, well, a few different things. I know that growing up, my dad, he's sort of a collector of music of all sorts, but one of his big genres was he liked a lot of new wave music, and there's some goth overlap there because most of the bands that I think were his big favorites in that era weren't ones that were necessarily like goth. They were like, Depeche Mode and Ultravox. But he also, among that, he liked The Cure and Susie and the Banshees. So I got introduced to sort of goth and goth adjacent genres very young because of that. And the goth scene was something. Now, this is kind of funny. My specific story of how I became curious about it was because my mom has always been sort of a proto Disney adult, I guess. She was a Disney adult before it was trendy.
Mhm.
And, we had Disney passes like most families growing up in Southern California. And one day when I was 7 or 8, we were in a lovely day in August. We were at Disneyland and there were a lot of goths there. And it was very
I was at one of
curious.
those events. It was one of the goth gatherings at Disneyland.
Yes, and we found out later that it was Bats Day. And and then they would also gather a lot at Disneyland during Haunted Mansion Holiday, which started like a few years later. And I took quite a liking to the Nightmare Before Christmas, so I became curious about this scene of people that sort of were surrounded this movie and this genre. So between, I already sort of knew about new wave-ish and alternative goth adjacent and some goth music, and then I became curious about this scene of people, and it all sort of came together. And and so at first I just sort of listened to bands that, like, when it came to goth bands, were just ones that like I already knew about through my dad. But then, when the early 2000s rolled around and we got an internet connection finally, I started actually looking up goth on the internet. So I was, an internet goth in the early and mid 2000s, which was actually a pretty terrible time to be goth because, or not to be goth, but just like to be an internet goth, because people on the internet in the 2000s were very mean. And I don't know, everyone was very obsessed with not being a poser, but not declaring yourself goth. So that was a pretty horrible thing to instill in a young person's mind. But on a positive note, I did, when I wasn't trawling, message boards and seeing people argue about whether or not this person was a poser, I was also introduced to interesting bands. And fortunately, because I'm very privileged to have grown up in a big city, I was able to check out CDs from the library of like Bauhaus and Joy Division and all of them. And so that, and this was when I was in middle school. So like I said, very blessed to have lived in a big city and to been able to do that. And then by the time I was like in high school, that's when iTunes was a thing. I feel like I'm really dating myself right now. And by bringing up iTunes. And so I was sort of able to find bands there that, I couldn't necessarily find at the library. And also because people used to do this thing where they'd like compile playlists on iTunes that they'd share, and they'd be like, this is goth, or it's kind of like what they have on Spotify now.
Right.
Except you could buy it. So those were actually very helpful. And I mean, I know people, even it seems like then, were sort of making fun of the Cleopatra Records albums that were like goths do David Bowie or whatever. But those albums actually did introduce me to quite a few people back then when I was a youngling in the 2000s.
Yeah, we all make fun of them, but we all started with them too.
Yes. Okay. So
maybe just an anecdote, just that my first interaction with why has my brain just gone blank? The movie you mentioned. Wow.
Nightmare Before Christmas.
Jesus Christ, what is happening today? Yeah, the first time I saw Nightmare Before Christmas was, I think I was maybe 15, and it was at my girlfriend's 15 or 16. My girlfriend's family party. They were watching it in their living room, I think. And at the time, all I knew about it was my parents had told me it was evil to some degree because they were, conservative Christian. But I remember that was the first time I saw it, and I watched part of the movie and remember feeling very conflicted because at one part of me thought, I'm not supposed to like this because it's satanic or whatever. And the other part of me thinking, this is probably the coolest thing I've ever seen in my whole life. So it's just neat to hear you also had connected through gothy things through that way.
Yeah, and I've often sort of referred to myself as a privileged goth, not because I was like super privileged in a lot of obvious ways, but because I'm lucky that I was in a big city and that my parents weren't like judgmental. Because like I said, I literally discovered some bands through my dad, and they never really told me, oh, you can't listen to that. And I always had access to things, and like the only rules about like clothes growing up were like, I know when I was very young, I wasn't allowed to wear things with skulls or obvious references to death, like references, like, weapons or anything like that. But other than that, they were just kind of like, oh, whatever. So I think that has kind of reading some goth anecdotes. Some of them I haven't been able to relate to because I was fortunate for that. But yeah, that's just my experience.
Out of curiosity for me, do you remember what year that Bats Day revelatory event was for you?
It was the late 90s. It may have been the first Bats Day ever.
Okay, yeah, it was definitely before. I went to Bats Day in 2007, so that was much later than you got into it.
Yeah, because I've been to many Bats Days since intentionally. Because the first one I went to intentionally was, I think, the summer between 4th and 5th grade for me. That was a lot of fun. I went with my older, or no, it was between 5th and 6th, one of those two. Because I went with my older sister and my cousins, and that was a lot of fun. And then, yeah, then I went to one in high school, and then I've been to a few as an adult, and haven't been to any since COVID, but yeah.
Yeah. So when did you start I know when, but how did starting the Tumblr and the YouTube channel come about, and kind of what motivated you to start doing that?
The Latin American goth thing.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, something that I thought was sort of interesting is that, I'm a Latino, and so are, I'd say most, maybe not most, but a good proportion of the goths in the Los Angeles area, to a point where it's almost a stereotype down here. And I always thought it was interesting that, when, think of the way goths are stereotyped just in general culture, it's sort of very, specifically Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, white type of thing. And I was like, well, this is not reflective of my goth experience.
Yeah.
And I started sort of, the wheels were turning in my head about that initially. I was like, has anyone ever, I don't know, commented on this in any way? And I found a few random articles online, or these not BuzzFeed, but one of those this one, I forget what it's called, but it's basically Latino BuzzFeed. And it was 25 ways Latinos are gother than everyone. I found some silly things like that.
Or Vice or something.
Yeah, one of those. Yeah. And then, but the thing that I think was the thing that officially got me to do this was one day I was at Release the Bats, R.I.P. Release the Bats, and I heard this song, and it was in English, so I wasn't automatically aware that it was a Mexican band. And I was like, what is this song? Because I recognized that the person had an accent, but when people are singing, you can't always place accents. And I didn't have Shazam at the time. So I was like, what is this song? I was typing in random words that I heard. Google wasn't helping. Eventually the DJ made a list, and I was going through all the songs that I didn't already recognize. And then I was like, oh, and I discovered this band, Mecro Kiev was the artist, and they were from Mexico. And I'm like, oh, cool, a Mexican goth band from Mexico. Because, at the time when, I looked up Latino goth, all I could find was Prayers, which is not personally my thing, but if you like it, good for you. So then I started actually typing in goth with country to see I wonder if there's any more, and I found out that there was quite a few. Initially I was I found Aves Aveces through that, and I think most people know about Caifanes to some extent, and I found all these goth bands from Latin America, and I'm like, has anybody talked about these? And I saw that not only was there not specifically like a Latin American goth, YouTube or anything, but a lot of these bands just weren't getting recognized on a large scale because, well, even then, GothTube, a lot of it is not music based. A lot of it's makeup and clothes, which I'm actually not opposed to because I understand now how music works and how YouTube works. And how talking about music and sharing music there is actually really hard. But anyways, so I was like, I'm gonna start a YouTube channel and talk about goth bands from Latin America. And originally when I did start it, it was a little broader. I talked about other things too, but now I've sort of narrowed it down to just music. So yeah, that was that thought process and what led to the channel, and which I've been doing for a few years now, and so that's what led to that. And yeah, that's been pretty interesting. I know that YouTube is you kind of have to be careful because you're only allowed to share so much music, and talking about music without playing it is also a struggle. Which is like why I sort of mentioned, I'm like, I don't mind that not all goth tubers talk about music all the time because YouTube is unfortunately very anti-sharing music. So I've had to sometimes deal with that. But, in the end, I do what I can. And people say that they have learned about bands through me. So clearly I've found a way to do that.
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic resource. I know, obviously hopefully people who listen have looked at the master list that I've shared before, and the Facebook page. You share like Bandcamp links and things on there. The reviews are fantastic. It's really, it's a great place to find music, and like you say, there is a dearth of people talking about music from Latin America. So it's really wonderful to hear your opinions on it, and also just to see get visibility to bands that are making really good music as well.
Yeah, and I'm glad to see that a few of the bands have gotten bigger in recent years. And I know some people are like, oh, it's because of you, and I'm like, I actually don't think it's because of me. Some of the bands were already like known because of connections to other things and people, but yeah. Well, something that I've actually learned sort of recently, because I thought it was curious that a few of the bands, like Last Dusk, for example, who's from Costa Rica, they have performed at like goth festivals in, the UK, and then, Ariel Maniki and the Black Halos has been to some places in Europe. And I was like, why'd they go all the way there when the US is so close? Why didn't they come to the US ever? And it's basically because of the US's like visa immigration laws. So even if a country is like literally touching, it's sometimes harder to go there. I mean, Costa Rica isn't touching the US, but even if it's like touching the same landmass, just because of legal stuff, it's harder to go there than to, places that are like in a whole other hemisphere.
Yeah.
And I wish the US they changed that, because I'm like, come on, I want to see all the bands.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's kind of interesting learning about like, how visas affect bands who want to tour internationally.
Yep.
Which has actually it's affected, other goth bands like Clan of Zymox wasn't able to come to the US once, and Cellophane wasn't able to come to the US once. And
I think Soviet had that problem at one point.
Yeah.
Yeah, a few bands.
And I was like, so, which is weird because, the US is kind of thought of as like the center of culture, and which it isn't. But
the US is thought as the center of culture by the US.
The US, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, but they like to present themselves as like, we're the center of culture, and anyone who's made it from another country will come here. And it's like, well, you're not allowing them to, even if people in the US want them to come here. It's like, but, I'm going to try to make an effort to, go to like goth festivals elsewhere in the world, but I haven't been able to do that yet, because I actually have a fair number of friends in Germany, or people, connections to Germany.
Yeah.
It's like, maybe I'll
Very
make it to
cool.
one of those.
Yeah.
And I really want to go to the Goth Festival in Lima, Peru, because that's, speaking of things that are actually relevant to goth music in Latin America and my channel and all that. But yeah, that's a place I've never been to. But
I'll have to look that up because I've been meaning to visit. I mean, a number of places in South America, though Patagonia has been my kind of number one, but Peru's definitely up there as well. And I would love to get out to Lima, and being able to do that when there's a goth festival at the same time would be perfect.
Yeah. That is, something because I have a list. Yeah, I also have, I have a list of places I want to go, and that's a place that would be nice to go anyways. But it's like, yeah, if there also happens to be a goth fest, that would be great. And
yeah. I legitimately don't remember if I mentioned this to you, Trey, but that there was a neat connection. My friend Ryan from the band Witch Hands, after we did the episode with Jose from Hueco, he reached out to Jose, and they got to chatting, and they're doing guest vocals on songs for each other's bands.
Oh, nice. That's really cool.
Well, something that I think is kind of cool on this subject of international goth stuff is that I guess what's his name? Ariel Maniki, and from Ariel Maniki and the Black Halos, and who's connected to pretty much every goth band in Costa Rica that's still functioning. And then the guy from Kentucky Vampires, they have like a duo thing going right now. And man, what's it called? One moment. I'm gonna have to look this up, and you can cut out me talking about looking this up.
No, yeah. I thought I vaguely remember them. Are you talking about them doing a collaboration with somebody? Oh, yes, that's right.
They did the Waning Moon, and I saw that. I'm like, oh, does that mean, is Ariel Maniki going to come to the U.S. at some point? Are they going to perform together? And I don't even think the Kentucky Vampires has come out my way, the West Coast. But I was like, oh, that'd be cool if they could do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I don't know, that's something that I think is very cool about goth is like all the international people will a lot of times end up working together and like, oh, it's kind of, I don't know, it's like a weird, like not cult, but like everyone knows each other.
So let me ask you one more question then before we get into the main part of the episode. If you could narrow it down to one interesting or exciting or surprising thing that you learned or took away from or was really inspirational to you that you've learned since you started doing all this additional research into Latin American goth music?
I discovered that Peru had a really cool scene, and I thought that was really random and specific. So it's just sort of made me consider like the history of music, and because seeing that like some countries have had goth bands since the 80s, which is pretty much, around the same time it started in like Europe and the US and stuff, whereas some didn't until much later. And a lot of that, the reasons that, people are able to do certain genres or record them anyways, because, sometimes there's bands that exist that aren't able to come public, has to do with like, political situations. So, I guess I've had to realize the way that like, I guess music genre has sometimes been suppressed. And, but on the other hand, even in places where goth music seems to be pretty recent, a lot of them still have really good bands. So I've discovered like certain places, more like regions, because, some countries are very small, some are massive, but and have like, regions within the country, because, people outside of the US don't realize that other countries also have states and stuff like that, basically. Is that seeing the something that I guess is sort of true for the US as well, but it's definitely true, is the way like certain places favor certain genres, and I don't really know why that is anywhere. So I want to sort of I guess, examine why that is. It's like there's this sort of electro dark punky thing that seems to be really a thing in like central Mexico, and it's like, how did that happen there? I don't know. And it's like, why is, in Brazil, the broader post-punk and goth are sort of considered the same thing, whereas in other places the definition of goth or post-punk even is more narrow.
Yeah.
And because these are all, I think, discussions people have been having about goth generally, but when I'm looking more locally, it kind of forces you to examine that a bit more. It's like, the way, the history of music and the history of genre is it's very regional.
Yeah.
And people talk about it differently in different places. And because, going back to, I briefly mentioned thinking people on the internet in the 2000s were mean. Something I noticed was the way people would sometimes talk about the goth scene in other countries and be like, oh, those people there are posers. And it's like, because the music was different or because of whatever. And it's like, well, different places have different histories with subculture and with genre.
Right.
That's something I think people need to take into consideration.
And as you also mentioned, the potential restrictions from cultural or political forces as well. So sometimes you have to, quote unquote, water down a sound to even be able to produce an album and sell it in the area.
Excellent. Well, KB, thank you so much for sharing a little about yourself. I'm really excited to have you on the show. I'm really honestly grateful for all the amazing work that you do with your channel and your Tumblr and everything. So I'll have talked about this in the introduction, but all of the links to your content will be in the show notes. So everyone, if you haven't already, should go follow those links, subscribe, follow on social media and stuff like that. You'll get a lot of resources to, and you can just scroll through the back catalog, right, and get a lot of resources to cool stuff you probably haven't heard of already.
Yeah, that's a funny thing I've learned is that Tumblr, I think I'm one of the few people still on Tumblr because it's actually one of the best social media websites for sharing music from Bandcamp. So that's a fun thing to let people know.
Yeah. I've never used it, so I will take your word for it. I know Michelle, our friend of the show, Michelle, our resident queen of goth, uses Tumblr. But yeah. Cool. So for this episode, the remainder of this episode, we're doing something different that we haven't really done before. Essentially, each of us have, before today, picked 2 albums. So all of us leading up to the episode have listened to 6 albums in total. Probably more than once. I won't speak for anyone else, and for the purpose of discussing the albums. And so to make it a little more interesting than just picking 2 random albums, the prompt I gave everyone was to select an album that you remember fondly, but haven't listened to in many years. So the idea was this would be kind of a roundabout way to learn more about each other and about ourselves through kind of personal anecdotes or through the lens of some time in our lives, and then kind of face our own nostalgia and reflect on how we've grown as people, and reflect on the specific time of the scene itself, and see if the music has kind of grown with us. And I also thought it would just be fun from a podcast perspective to, I guess, issue the normal format and listen to these albums. If you're familiar with them, you can kind of reminisce and think about them and think about that time in the goth scene, or get a new angle on the music of this scene. Let's go. I guess I don't know if I actually want to go first.
I can go first.
Because why don't you go first, KB? Let's see, what album would you want to talk about first?
Okay, so it's kind of funny because both of the albums I picked are very relevant to the growing up anecdotes I gave. So I think the first one of the two I discovered was Diabolical Streak by Jill Tracey.
Okay, awesome.
Which I discovered on one of those iTunes mixes. The song Evil Night Together was featured on some This Is Goth playlist. And I'd never really heard anything like that at that point. And I saw that the album was actually from 1999. When I heard it, it was 2007 or 8. I think 2008. Which is kind of funny because I think in a way she was ahead of her time, because that whole dark cabaret thing kind of became big in like the late 2000s, early 2010s. And that was my introduction to that. And I was very fascinated by her whole thing because, like I said, at that point, I'd never heard anything like that. And I was like, oh. And I also had this long time interest in like classical music, which now she's a little bit post-classical, the style that she's emulating, because it's sort of cabaret-ish, jazzy almost. Not sure exactly how you classify, but she has sort of like a 1920s aesthetic, I think is what she's the 1920s, 1930s aesthetic, and that's sort of the sound that she tries to do. And so I was like, wow, this is like this flapper lady, and she's doing spooky music where she's talking about the end of the world and evil nights. And yeah, so that intrigued me. And then over the next few years, there was the whole like dark cabaret steampunk boom, which I will admit I did slightly partake in. Fortunately, I didn't take lots of pictures during that era. But I think as those artists go, I feel like Jill Tracey is kind of one of the ones that holds up the best, because she didn't have that whole like evil bedlam clown persona that a lot of people did. And also her music, I think, was a little bit more subdued. It was just, a piano and her voice. There are a few other instruments, but that was the main thing. And also, fun fact, when I saw Peter Murphy in Santa Ana a few years back, she was backing him up, and I got to see her live, and that was very cool. Yeah.
That is really cool.
So I was like, oh, cool, because, I didn't even know she was going to be backing him up when I saw her, because, I think around that time, she had some health problems, so she wasn't in all the tour, but she was there when I got to see him, so that was really good.
So how did you feel about listening back to this then? Did it hold up for you, or?
I think so, for the most part. Like, yeah, I didn't cringe at it the way I do some, because I was mentioning, it's like, oh, there was a lot of stuff that was kind of similar that came out later. That stuff I didn't listen to nearly as long, and I'm like, oh, this is cringy. Whereas this, I think it's still like, it's nice, and it's like, I think it's sort of a subdued spooky, and I think it needs to be played more at subtle goth parties, I guess.
Yeah.
Does that? Yes.
Yeah.
It's very like nice, calm background, and it could just sound, it's very obviously spooky because of the way she says things, but I don't know, it takes listening to realize exactly how much.
Right, yeah, you have to pay attention.
Yeah, do any of you, had either of you heard of her before?
Not me, no.
Oh.
I hadn't heard of her specifically. I've loved dark cabaret for a very long time.
Oh, okay.
And my first introductions were actually, I would say, you kind of said that the 2000s was sort of the emergence of this. It was kind of almost a revival of it, but not really a revival because it just never really became popular. It was when it did get popularized, but it had been going since, I'd say, maybe the 80s a little bit. One of the big bands that was sort of early dark cabaret, other than going all the way back to actual cabaret, and some of the like the big one that everybody knows, that's sort of one of the forefathers, is the Three Penny Opera with the Mac the Knife. That's the one that kind of starts this whole dark cabaret thing, and that's been covered by everybody in the world.
Nick Cave.
Yep, and that's a big sort of touchstone for this. And then of course you've got the movie, which is based on the musical Cabaret, talking about Weimar era Germany and sort of the bourgeoisie cabaret scene, the whole very sort of wealthy underground kind of seedy scene in Germany right before World War II, right before it crashed and World War II started. But one of the sort of big artists that I've seen mentioned a lot in the history of dark cabaret is the Tiger Lilies, who started in the 1980s, doing sort of that Brechtian cabaret, Mac the Knife kind of style, but talking about apocalypse and murders and stuff like that. But probably one of the first things that I heard that was in this style was either the one track on Ashes by Christian Death, I think Lament.
Yeah.
Which is very dark cabaret. And then also Roz's and Gitan, their duet album, Dream Home Heartache.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. From, like,
those were
90s,
sort of so those were sort of my first introduction to that general style of this sort of dark lounge jazz cabaret thing. And I just ate it up. I loved it. So I don't think I've probably heard some of Jill Tracey's stuff, but I didn't associate it with a person. It would be like on a list or a compilation of multiple cabaret artists. I don't know. Was she on the Project Records comp that came out in the mid 2000s? Their dark cabaret comp. Do you know?
I mean, I can Google it.
I don't.
Yeah, I could look it up. She might have been. And then, of course, Amanda Palmer was another one of the 2000s popularizers of it, especially with her Dresden Dolls.
Yeah, I mean, I was into the Dresden Dolls in the 2000s.
Which I'd have to mention that she is very problematic if we bring her up, but
that's fair.
Yeah.
That's fair.
Yeah, it looks like Jill Tracey has CDs for sale on the Project Records website at least, and was on a various artists ornamental holiday collection.
Oh wow.
That's what I saw from a quick search.
I was never really aware of the actual like records, because whenever I bought them, back in the 2000s anyways, I either bought them like on iTunes or I got them with gift cards to Best Buy or Barnes and Noble. So
yeah. So I just looked it up. Evil Night Together was on Dark Cabaret 1 by Project.
Oh, Dark Cabaret 2, I think she was on also.
She was. Dark Cabaret 2 had In Between Shades.
Attrition was on Dark Cabaret 2. That's really cool. ThouShaltNot was on there. Look at that. Voltaire.
Yeah, there are a lot of good bands. I mean, Christian Death, Roz Williams Flowers, which was another one of the Dark Cabaret ones, was on the first of the comps.
So what do you think about this album, Trey? Go ahead and continue.
So I love the album. I mean, I knew I would as soon as when I saw Jill Tracey pop up, I didn't necessarily recognize the name, but I looked up all of the artists before I even started listening to them, and I saw Dark Cabaret. I'm like, okay, this is probably going to be my favorite one from this entire listening thing, because I just love it. And I've been getting into, it's a related genre, but I looked up Gothic jazz several months ago. I think I made it as a suggestion at one point, and discovered the genres of dark jazz / jazz noir, which are all instrumentals usually, but the same sort of dark cabaret / David Lynchian kind of soundtrack music that I really love. So this fit right in with that sort of thing. I love torch singers. I love cabaret music. I was really big into the burlesque scene when I first moved back to Chicago, and a lot of them tend to focus on that genre as well. So I've just listened to a lot of it, and I loved it. I thought Jill was an amazing singer. She's got a really good sort of smoky, sensuous, whispery jazz voice that doesn't stick too much to comfortable tones. It slides in and out of melodies, and it's very sexy. I love that kind of voice. So that was really good. I loved the instrumentation. You mentioned it being pretty stripped down, but I didn't think it was that stripped down. She uses a lot of, I mean, it was pretty minimal, but she uses a lot of exotic techniques. Yeah. Because it definitely was, I mean, there's piano, but a lot of string, a lot of woodwinds, really emphasizing that. But the string techniques weren't your standard, like, sappy strings. You have a lot of the sort of experimental techniques of the screeching and rattly string tones when they're playing them outside of their normal ranges. And I love extended string techniques that are, you mostly hear them in horror movie soundtracks, but the more I can see them incorporated in any other music genres, I love that. So yeah, I really just love how that use of sort of those extended techniques allows her to retain the richness of the sort of the organic instruments and their dynamism that works well with her voice, while also leaning into the sort of experimental sound design aspect that really leads me into, some of the more experimental alleyways in the goth subgenre. That is really where I tend to gravitate towards. So it really does a good job of marrying that sort of aesthetic of doom and gloom and the sort of weird creepiness of weird sounds made on organic instruments. And I thought it was just a great ambiance that I had it. So I love the album.
Yeah. KB, I already knew I liked you, but this was a fantastic way to cement that predilection. I can't remember the last time I listened to Dark Cabaret or Neo Cabaret. I know we kind of talked about some other bands that have done similar things in the goth scene. I remember from my own experience a time in the early 2000s when that style was being incorporated into a lot of different bands in the goth scene. Stuff that I was hearing at the time was like Rasputina, the Deadfly Ensemble. We talked about Dresden Dolls already. Black Tape for a Blue Girl, obviously, like Project Record stuff. Cinema Strange toyed with some Dark Cabaret stuff.
Yep.
Who was I've forgotten the band name. What was her? She did the industrial violin thing.
Emily Autumn?
Emily Autumn kind of did some of that.
Yeah, she's, to me, kind of who I think of when I think of as that whole steampunky dark cabaret movement.
Right.
So,
yeah.
It's obviously there were other times when I think of when it got big, so to speak, when it became its own thing. That's who I associate with it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, she was huge for a while, musically. And it's, it's not in vogue anymore. So I think it's one of those things that's of its era, where in 20 years we'll look back at the time right now and think, oh yeah, that's when post-punk and darkwave was really popular. And then we'll go back to listening to our chiptune aggro pop gothcore band or whatever the fuck we're listening to in 20 years. So yeah, as I started listening to this, the first thing I noticed obviously was Jill's voice. It evokes that 1920s film era kind of vibe for me. It's sultry but commanding in this really understated, powerful way. It's sort of this I know the spotlight is on me and I'm gonna lounge in the glory, and aren't you lucky to be here kind of thing. The lyrics are wonderful. They're so whimsical and fun and clever. It reminds me a lot of the movie Mirror Mask, if anyone has seen that. Trey, I think you've seen that.
I don't think I have actually, but I may have. I'll have to look
Mask,
it up.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a definite recommendation. One of my favorite movies. Trey, we'll have to watch that together. Don't watch that on your own.
Okay.
That'll be a movie night for us if we can manage it. It's got some of the same artistic vibes and sound to it. There's this thematic playfulness, but that it also has this razor's edge to it. The lyrics are evocative and poetic. To me, it doesn't really have the quality of a song where you are necessarily going to sing along to it, but it doesn't really matter because it's more of a take you on a journey kind of thing where you have a master storyteller and you're just going to let that wash over you. And so from that then from a musical perspective, if you're going to try and stick it in the goth genre, it has the dramaticism and the theatricality side of goth, with the glam part of that. It's all the decadence and elegance side of that kind of thing. And then to pick out a few songs from the album, The Proof I really liked. It's probably my favorite track. There's, I think, what are tubas and oboes and violins, and there's this haunting piano. And then that's broken up by a quicker paced kind of like waltzy cabaret section. And it feels to me like the inside of an Edward Gorey book. It's just lyrically so visceral, and it feels like you can see the lyrics like they're a storybook. And all the songs on this album have this ebb and flow to them, but this is the longest track on the album, so there's really room for it to breathe.
Yeah, and I definitely see the Edward Gorey in that, because it's almost like they're quoting Gashley Crumb Tinies in some of it.
Right. And so because it's so long, it feels like it's taking its time to kind of go on a stroll through the song. So it's more about the journey, and the destination can wait. So you're on this winding path, and it's so delightful you don't want to get to the destination. And then the song You Leave Me Cold is this velvety smooth jazz number that that makes me want to put on tights and a top hat and grab a glass of whiskey. I like that song adds light jazz drums in the background, because there aren't too many songs that have drums on the album. So and the preceding track for me, which was The Other Side of Pain, was musically, I think, the most samey sounding on the album. So this gives it kind of a kick after coming after that one. You get these light like rim shots and the light tom-toms, and it sounds like they're using a drum brush on the snare and these light cymbals and stuff. Just a real sexy track, and you get some light bass guitar. And then Doomsday Serenade was also a highlight because it has this Parisian flair to it. And it's really light and bright and fun. And then the lyrics are really whimsical and dark, though, where she's talking about tiptoeing through the carcasses and bones and the blood filling the sea after doomsday. And it's the perfect kind of dark cutesy for me. So I would never really say I've slinked around my house before, but this had me slinking around my house. So I really loved this album. Yeah, I didn't think about it like you, Trey, in terms of, what was my favorite album out of all the albums. But if I had to pick, I probably would go with this one. Yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't naturally trying to think that way, but this just stood out so much to me that it made itself the top without even me having to think about it.
Well, Trey, do you want to go with one of yours next, and then I'll do mine last?
Sure.
I know I've completely switched the order I said I would do it in now, but it doesn't matter.
Doesn't really matter. So I'm going to start with, because I'd say it's probably the most similar to Jill's album. I'm going to go with My Scarlet Life, Buzzbomb.
Oh, the tribally one.
Yeah, the tribally trip-hoppy one.
Okay, yeah.
So that's the one that I picked. So that's a band that I discovered back when I was, first getting into the goth scene. They're sort of got big in the late 90s, kind of following on the coattails of the sort of trip-hop boom that happened over that period. So they kind of were digging in on that, and I started hearing them a little bit in clubs. Trip hop wasn't necessarily played a lot on goth clubs because it wasn't really a goth genre. It's just another electronic genre. But there were a handful of bands that seemed to mix the sort of goth aesthetic with the sort of trip hop aesthetic. And My Scarlet Life seemed to be one of those. Though partly probably why I was introduced to them in the goth scene is they were also a Chicago area band.
Yeah.
They never really got a lot of play. When I was looking at some of their information about their touring, it sounded like they really toured mostly in the sort of Midwest and a little bit into central Canada. They never really spread out much beyond that. So it wouldn't surprise me if KB, you had never heard of them before.
Yeah, I hadn't.
Because I don't think they would have gotten all the way to the West Coast. I certainly was pretty sure they didn't ever travel that far. But it was, so Preston Click is sort of the main musical force behind that. He's not the singer. He has a pair of singers that sing throughout the My Scarlet Life who went on to do their own careers. But he's sort of the driving force behind the music production and songwriting and all that. And then they were singing along with the tracks that he was writing. And he seems, from what I could read, and I was struggling to find a lot of information about the band, and I was kind of researching them. I knew bits and pieces, or at least I remembered vaguely bits and pieces about their history. And I think he did work initially with like Ministry.
He did. I looked it up. Yeah, he worked on Ministry stuff.
Okay. Yeah, I think he did some stuff just with Wax Trax in general, given that he was a Chicago music producer, and Wax Trax was big in Chicago and had Ministry, and some of those 90s era industrial bands were big on that label. So I think that's where he sort of came up, and then he started doing his own bands, starting with Big Hat, which I've never heard any Big Hat. I can't find any Big Hat. So if anybody listening to this knows where I could find some Big Hat, I'd love to listen to it.
Come over tomorrow night. I'll give you some Big Hat.
I bet you will. In my ear holes.
It won't fit, but we'll try.
Well, you get what you can.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'd like to hear some of that stuff, because I heard that that's sort of his more experimental rocky thing, where they tamed it down a little bit with My Scarlet Life. But I was big into the trip hop thing in the 90s, and I still do really love trip hop. So it's not something that I necessarily gravitated away from. But yeah, this was one of the first times I'd heard it outside of the radio. I'd heard, of course, Portishead and some of those bands on the radio in the 90s when I was first introduced to the genre, but this was the first kind of band I'd heard slotted into like goth playlists. And the track that usually got played the most is the last track on the album, Fire. That was possibly the one that got played a lot on various goth scenes around here. Some of the other ones were a little bit more mixed as far as whether they'd be appropriate, because it really did bounce back and forth between being really dark or being more trip hoppy and kind of bouncy and not as goth appropriate, but for the most part they do have that dark thread throughout. But what I love his use of so many different sounds and instruments that he puts in this big collage over the trip hop beat. And I really do love the pair of singers and how they harmonize with one another, and the way they interleave their vocal melodies and kind of fade in and out. One will take the fore, then the other one will come forward, and you kind of get a lot of mixing that way. So I really did love it. Now on second listen, now since that's sort of the theme here, is I had not listened to My Scarlet Life in a very long time. Hadn't really listened to a lot of trip hop in a while. As much as I still love it, it's definitely an of its time kind of genre, so I can't say it felt like it's ageless. It definitely doesn't last as well, and it's not as good as my memory of it was. I still really enjoyed it, and I was really glad to get back into it. And some of the tracks, like Fire, I still really love. Kind of like Black Limbo a lot. The second track, that was another one of the ones that really sort of stood the test of time for me. So I still really enjoyed it, but it did feel a little bit dated and of its time.
I did see in some of the reviews I was looking at, a couple people said that they thought this was the weakest album of the
exactly
discography.
What site you were looking at too.
Oh, were you looking? Okay, yeah.
Yeah. That sort of weird site that was a specific type of music that all seemed to, I don't remember what it was called.
Strangely, every site I could find talking about this band was a weird site, because there weren't any mainstream websites talking about My Scarlet Life.
Yeah, I heard that too. I was trying to choose between, because I have their main 3 albums. I did gravitate towards this one because it did have Fire, which was one that was played a lot at goth clubs. So that's the main reason I did this one. I can't say this is their best album, but it's the one that I associate the most with sort of the introduction to the band and its association with being in goth clubs in the 90s as well.
So KB, what did you think about this album?
Well, so as a note, I think I'm the youngest one here. I was born in 1992. So obviously I never heard this in a goth club.
Neither did I.
But it definitely, it kind of invoked that sound of like, I could definitely tell it was from the 90s listening to it, because I'm like, oh, I remember hearing music like that then, and hearing music like this when I was watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Yep.
So, yeah, I mean, well, to me, I am sort of a trip hop appreciator, I guess you could say, in general. And I thought it was cool. I didn't do as much research into the band and their history and the rest of their discography as it sounds like you two did on the other genres. I just listened to them and I was like, okay, this is my thoughts.
Yeah, essentially that's my job since I was the one introducing him. So I felt I had to know as much as I could about the band to introduce it.
Yeah.
Okay, because I'm like, yeah, I listened to it. I was like, oh,
yeah, no, that's all
all
I
this
expected.
stuff about the guy. I don't know anything about
that's
any
fine.
of these people. So to me, I mean, like I said, I thought it was well, on the theme of like looking back, it kind of did feel like it was of its time, but not in a bad way.
So my thoughts on this, for a weird reference, this album immediately reminded me of a video game I played recently called Dreamfall: The Longest Journey, which has the same vibe, both musically and thematically, of being this kind of cultural soup. And it was made in a similar era, like you were saying, KB. And it you know, the soundtrack has the same kind of, you know, trip hop, electronica, ethereal qualities. But it takes place across a vast array of locations and timelines and cultures that all jumble together. And this album to me really felt like cultural bingo over a trip hop beat, or at least go ahead.
Because it was doing that sort of like tribal sound that was big during that era, because people were like, oh, I'm sort of inspired by these cultures, and I feel like that's sort of fallen out of favor because of
cultural appropriation.
Yeah, and that's
his
another
second
subject.
Band, the band he did after this, Karma Sutra, really doubled down on that and had much more of the sort of Faith in the Muse, Dead Can Dancey vibe. Still with the sort of electronic beat, but yeah, that band definitely doubled down on the sort of tribal aspects you're keying on there.
Which, because anytime I hear anything that's tribal but modern, but like any kind of tribe, whether we're talking Celtic or whatever, that definitely brings me back to the 90s, because that various things I associate with that time, which I'll mention more when we get to your next album, because it's more relevant.
Enigma and Lorena McKennitt.
Oh yeah, it had, you know, because there's like there's tracks that sound to me like American interpretations of Egyptian or Arabic kind of music, or like westernized Mediterranean music.
Yes.
And so, and that's very much like the same thing, that game that I was playing where I had that same vibe, which was made like in the same time period. So it's this weird kind of, because, you know, I was born in 87. So, and also I was very sheltered, so a lot of the pop culture zeitgeist stuff, I didn't really know what was going on. So that was kind of barely out of my periphery anyway. So it's just kind of this, for me, a weird experience of like, oh yeah, this is a time in American culture that I kind of knew about but never really experienced. So it was just strange. So I pulled this quote from from Preston, the keyboardist, who's described the band as kind of trippy with a little hip-hop, sometimes hypnotic with a dose of sensuality, erotica, tripnotica. It rolls pleasantly off the tongue, much like our music caresses the ear, the heart. And then some other references I saw were to bands like Portishead, Tricky, and Kate Bush, and Dead Can Dance.
Yep.
So,
well, the most similar things I could think of is that one song that Alanis Morissette did for the Dogma soundtrack.
Uninvited, I think.
I have no idea what that is, but
I think Uninvited
Still,
is
that's
the
what
one
it's
you're
called.
thinking of. Still? Okay.
Yeah, and I love you still. Da, 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 da.
Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah.
So I
think
don't
I
know,
know.
not exactly goth or, well, kind of alternative, but it invoked that to me a lot because it did the sort of like westernized idea of like Indian type music. And then also this other band, Red Light District, which you probably never heard of because, well, okay, the only reason I know about them is because the lead singer of that band during the 2000s was also a theater actress, and she was in a play that I wrote in high school for this high school theater competition. So that's the only reason I know who they are. But also she backed up Jill Tracey once, so relevant to still relevant to the conversation, yay. Because that was sort of a goth trip hop type of band. So I'm reminded of those two, one of which you've heard of, one of which you haven't. So,
Where's My Lucky Star was probably my favorite track.
I definitely played that on a couple times
really?
at a goth
Okay.
club. Oh yeah.
It's got this laid-back lounge house aura to it, like you're stepping into a smoky opium den. You've got gongs and bar chimes and a wooden cabasa, and then halfway through it sounds like aliens show up, abduct someone in the background, and then you sink back into a big fluffy cushion and have another huff from the hookah.
I love your description.
That's how I think about music, is like where it puts me visually.
I was just like, oh, it was cool, it was nice. And you're like, oh, it makes me think of, you know, putting on a hat. And I'm like, wow.
Let's see. I also really liked Scarlet Worlds because for me that's the closest we get to something recognizable as like a Cure song or a Susie reminiscent track with sort of like a Cocteau Twins or Miranda Sex Garden twist to it.
Oh, you're setting up my next album.
Okay, well, it's my album next, so you'll have to.
I know.
Hold on that. And then the last track, Fires, that we talked about was also interesting because it uses a metal riff in the track that's almost... And then it almost has these like Gregorian singing interstitials, which again goes back to what we were talking about, this like postmodern approach to music where you're seeing genre as these free-floating signifiers to pull from and then imbue with new meanings based on context. So it's just wild.
Musical bricolage.
Yeah, exactly. So overall, this isn't a genre I'm familiar with. So it was a hell of a ride to go on because it was just a roller coaster of nonstop twists and turns. From that very first transition from the first song to the second song, I listened to the first song, I'm like, okay, I think I know where we're going. And then the second song starts and I'm like, okay, I have no idea what the fuck's going to happen on this album. So the weird thing was, as I was listening, I really could not picture. I was like, why did Trey pick this album? I cannot understand any crossover with the goth scene in a meaningful way, right? You talked about this a little bit already. So then I was Googling, trying to figure this out. I was thinking, obviously there's people like us who would enjoy this kind of thing, but I couldn't think of how there would be a broader crossover. And obviously I wasn't in the scene, so I don't have personal context to it. So what I found online was that the band played Convergence 4 in 1998 in Toronto. So obviously there must have been a demand for it. And then there was an interview that I think may have been what you saw also with, what was it, The Outsider or The Outcast or something. There was an interview online that I read where the author said someone, when he was trying to look into the band, had called them a goth band, and then in the interview he talks with the band about why he's asking them, why do you attract goths to your live shows? And so they spend a long time talking with the band about what the attraction there is. So it's just kind of like, I guess, one of those goth adjacent bands that people don't know what to do with, and then they get roped into the scene. And then we talked about like Preston played in Ministry and that kind of thing. Yeah, crazy album. And it'll be playing underneath as we've been talking as well, so you'll get a taste of that. All right, so my turn. So my first album was the album Tales of Absolution and Obsoletion by The Awakening, and I apologize if I'm a little long-winded here talking about this one in particular. So I've mentioned before that The Awakening was the first goth band I ever listened to.
Appropriately titled.
And named. yeah, really. So I was 14 years old, and I was just barely a mall goth, which meant I had maybe one pair of Hot Topic pants. And at the time, I was really more into metal and pop punk, because the skater subculture was the first kind of alt scene that I personally encountered and then was allowed to get into to any degree by my parents.
Okay.
So at the time, I had a subscription to H&M magazine, which stood for Heavy Music Magazine, and it was a Christian metal and alternative music magazine, which is why I was allowed to have a subscription to it. And so they would send out a sampler CD with their issues, and the September-October issue of 2001 had a song on the sampler CD with the track Dark Romantics by The Awakening, which was off of their The Fourth Seal of Zen album in 2000. And that was, I remember, the first the first actual goth song I ever heard. And I remember I was at the park and I got to that song, and it blew my mind, and it was like nothing I had ever heard. I wouldn't shut up about it to my best friend at the time. And I was like, I told him I finally found something that was actually a goth song, not like a metal song with like spooky interludes. And so then I became obsessed with trying to find more music that sounded like that. And I didn't know if it existed, but I was like, I have to find more music like this. So very quickly that became my favorite band. I went to as many shows as I could. I became, over the years, acquaintances with Ashton, the lead singer, the creator of the band, and his partner Rose. They were at my wedding eventually.
Oh, wow.
I DJ'd several of their concerts actually throughout 2008. And in 2009, on their tour for this album that I recommended, I also DJ'd 3 of their shows as well. So that was super cool for me. And so it was like a big full circle moment. And those are all really great memories for me, even though I was a completely sheltered baby bat chatting with these like cultured, worldly, seasoned musicians at the time, right? So this album, Tales of Absolution and Obsoletion, came out in 2009, and it was kind of a return to form for Ashton Knight. If I remember correctly, on the previous album, Razorburn, there were some issues with another band member, some differences of opinion on the music, and there was some like infighting among the band between them, and the production ended up coming out with like a more heavy metal kind of album that Ashton wasn't happy with. And I might be misremembering that, so I'm sorry if I just completely made that up. But so this went back to an older style of The Awakening, which was more like their Fourth Seal of Zen album, which was that 2001 I was talking about, which is more of the like dark romantic style, dark romanticism of their other stuff. And then a little bit about Ashton, like he's got this great musical palette. He's got influences from Bowie and Peter Murphy, obviously, from his vocal stylings, but also like Lydia Lunch, Mark Almond, Nick Cave, The Bangles, Johnny Cash, The Mission, IMX, Thompson Twins, Alphaville, Simon and Garfunkel, lots of 80s music. So that's all I'll say. Otherwise, I'll just be talking about Ashton facts all day. Yeah, I really tried to keep that short because I could talk about The Awakening for.
I get that. Yeah.
My thoughts on this album. So what I did for my 2 albums is, and I hope this isn't obnoxious, but I actually broke this down track by track.
That's fine.
Oh, wow.
We'll bring back memories of Mark.
Yeah, right. Yeah, old Cemetery Confession episodes. So I try to make these quick, so it shouldn't be too long. So Ivory, Part 1 and Part 2 is the first track. I really love when an album has an opening track that sets a tone rather than just jumping into a standard full-length track that's like everything else on the album, because it's just the dramaticism of setting up an experience and a vibe. And in this case, we get a track that's really dynamic. There's lovely piano and great melody. There's this like chugging, I don't know, metal on metal synth sound in the back that's just, it gives me this feeling of like a foggy night on cobblestone streets. And it's not a 2-minute intro track. You get like a full 6-minute song.
Yep.
That really, so it really commits to opening up the atmosphere for the album, which I love when albums do that. And I know you also like that, Trey. So that's already a good start to the album.
Yeah, and it actually kept that theme rather than what I always complain about when I love the first track and it's nothing like anything else.
Right.
That always frustrates me. But yeah, this did a good job of setting up the album with setting up the ambiance, and then it didn't follow up with the rest of the tracks like they're all the same.
Yeah.
But it did give you the right, put you in the right headspace to listen to the rest of the album.
I mean, and it's still kind of in that era of album craft when you still kind of wrote an album to be a cohesive thing instead of a bunch of singles.
Yeah.
So then Indian Summer Rain was the next track. My one complaint was I wasn't really a fan of the guitar line halfway through the song. I think it was a unique like riff to the gothic rock genre because it's drawing on a wider range outside of the wheelhouse of goth rock, which is, there's something to be said for that. Kind of plays into Ashton's strengths, but it just didn't work for me. But I will say that it works well with the tambourine and gives sort of this like mission vibe that complements the like gothic chorus that's going on in the song. But otherwise, we're introduced to that chugging guitar and this sort of like odd but recognizable synth line that for me kind of becomes the backbone of the album. And I think it's just a good goth rock track. It's got this chorus you can sing to, which for me is an important part of Awakening songs, at least for me, because it's in a similar vocal pitch to what I sing. So it's and I think they're catchy. So I like singing to his songs. Upon the Water is the next song. Great transition because this track is more grounded after the soaring Indian Summer Rain before it. There's a really nice mini breakdown in the middle of the track, which is something I don't hear much in goth rock bands today. Especially like a lot of the gothic rock I've been talking about in the like Sinister Suggestions recently. A lot of the albums they're just all go, like full send. And a lot of the tracks on this album focus on that dynamism. So you have parts of the song that are quieter and louder. Obviously, there's more of some parts have more of a post-punk guitar with a simple drum track and just Ashton's lush satin voice. And then those are followed by that more arena rock chorus, where you get some like phaser effect on the vocals for a few seconds. And then you get this lovely like heartbeat sounding breakdown that gives you a moment to breathe before you jump back into the chorus. And so I really like the way that he does that, at least, especially compared to what the goth rock I'm hearing today is like. Carnival of Souls is really similar to that previous track. It's slower, it's more grounded. There's another breakdown halfway through where they sort of deconstruct the guitar track, and Ashton does this really great Bowie-esque vocal that I think adds a great flair to the track and showcases his vocal range. And then the track closes out by ramping up into a more grand gothic sound of the earlier tracks. And then after that is Frozen. This kind of departs from everything before it and starts off sounding like, to me, it sounded like an in-game track for the Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines game. Because it features this very 90s sounding kind of simple MIDI synth beat that slowly then adds guitar and then this dun 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 bass line. And it's just this very specific like early 2000s sound that could fit into like the movie Subspecies or Queen of the Damned or something like that.
Oh.
It's not, again, like going back to this, it's not really something you hear anymore. But for me, it kind of plays into that vampire fantasy. It's this ultra moody thing that, again, goes back to that romantic kind of take on goth rock that The Awakening does. Nothing Like the Rain is after that. So The Awakening has done songs directly about vampires, but sometimes you just have a song that sounds like it could be on a soundtrack for a vampire. And for me, this song just gives that feeling for whatever reason. You get this twangy bass guitar, this kind of old school stripped down industrial beat in the background with that ghostly organ synth over the top. And then you have Ashton continuing to give his vocal performance that has such a good range. Where, like, for me, you kind of talk about, if you talk about somebody like Roz Williams, where, for example, people will say he's got eras. So you might say he's got his Bowie era or his Mark Bolan era or Donovan on this album. And for me, in this album, Ashton moves in and out of affectations and inflections from song to song and verse to verse. And maybe it's just because I'm listening so closely, but it's, to me, it's really impressive. I don't know. I've been rock hard listening to Ashton since 2000, so I should probably seek medical attention by now. I don't know, but I mean,
yeah, if your erection lasts more than 48 hours, you usually should.
After that is Where the Shadows Go. This is the first track that kind of falls flat for me. I like the spooky synth, but there's a synth solo here that I just don't think is that good. And the melody on this track doesn't do it for me. And overall, it just sounds a bit too samey. It's a bit dull and kind of mediocre in context of the album. I think it's good as its own track, but listening through the whole album, it's just like the weakest on the album. And after that is Open, which is a great romantic track. It's got a bit of a southern gothic flair, some gritty rock guitar, which goes great with Ashton's deep vocal over the top. He applies just a bit of echo at times to give this bit of depth and immensity, which gives the song a real punch, I think. And then you get another breakdown in this song where he uses a phaser effect that he sometimes uses in some of his songs, which has this like weird off-putting effect to it that makes it interesting, and I think it's another kind of like trademark of his. So I'm not sure how anyone else feels about it, but it's nice to hear it. It's kind of like a comfort food thing for me. And then the last song is Prayer for the Song. I love the way that they do a like note stepping up and down on this. It's like up and down and up and down. Because it feels like there's some influence from Johnny Cash here.
Yep.
And it just works so well. It's stripped
it's
back.
It's a sort of horse riding.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. It's very stripped back and empty at the beginning, which I love, again, because it's that dynamism. And so it's not just distortion from start to finish, right? Oh, that's not the last track. Alone is the last track.
I was going to mention,
sorry.
But yeah.
And that's the capstone for the album. You get a retro church organ that sounds like it's out of a horror film. And then you get this like wind blowing in the background and some soft drumming and piano, and it's just melancholy and lovely. So overall, it's been a long time since I've listened to this album. And so I thought I would be able to distance myself from the emotions of the album and my history with the band. But obviously I have not been able to do that or give any kind of objective review. So I am actually interested to hear any kind of critiques that or anything that either of you thought. But I loved it, and I thought it added something interesting to the gothic rock genre. In a way that bands like Golden Apes do for me. So yeah, I still love the album. So that's my review.
All right.
So of
say,
your
Katie?
two, I was actually familiar with The Awakening, but mostly through his newer stuff because of Lygia Resurrected, Adrian LeVay, Costtuber.
She reviewed the new album, yeah.
Yeah, and I think she's talked about his solo stuff too. Because I was gonna say, you were talking about his voice, and his voice gives me like musical theater rock opera type vibes.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean that in a good way. Sometimes I say that in a bad way, but I also say it in a good way. Because of like, maybe it's because it's like it has that sort of pointed emotion feel to it.
It's one of those
That
things
makes
that's a
sense.
fine line, right? If you get it right on the line, it's amazing. But if you go just a little past it, it's like, oh my God, you're so overdramatic.
And I don't know, I find like it's kind of funny that this is like from 2009, because this seems very sort of like, I feel like we've had a revival of this kind of music recently.
I think so, because and it makes sense too, because we had so much dark wave and post-punk for so long that it kind of makes sense that more goth rock bands would start coming out.
I don't know, I always thought, he's kind of cool because thematically a lot of the stuff that, the whole spooky vampire thing, I think people associate more with a like cheesier sound, or even a more like rocking sound, but more in a death rock way. So it's sort of interesting to hear it in the like gothic rock context. And I don't know, he's sort of like a cross between like, I don't know, second wave goth vibes and just like modern. Modern as in recent. I don't know, maybe he's what influenced all of this, because I realized like, oh, I actually do know who this is. And that's, I don't have your flowery language to say it's like floating through the woods or anything, but
Thank you for calling me flowery.
Yeah.
Yes, I sort of like the whole like, cathedral rock opera thing, like the whole like scary dramatic church. It appeals to the ex-Catholic in me.
Well, and that, I mean, that's interesting you mentioned that, because I didn't even want to get into the the whole religious aspect of, I'm not even going to, because we'll be here another hour before we get into the next album, so we'll just move on.
I mean, you mentioned that you discovered him because of like a Christian magazine.
So it ties into that whole thing, which so it
was at least viewed as safe for alternative Christian ears.
Right. And where does that end and begin for Ashton Knight and The Awakening and there are so many stories and crossovers I could tell, but time, we have only so much time.
Yeah. So as far as my reaction, I was a little bit concerned when I first started listening to this album, because I mean, I liked the instrumentals, I liked that intro track, but as soon as the voice came in, the initial strains of the voice was generic goth bass baritone voice number 2. So I was like, oh boy, because I've critiqued many bands about that. And, as we were mentioning the revival of this sort of style of music, and we've done a few bands in that, I guess could consider that revival on the show. And I'm always very down on that sort of stereotypic voice. And the reason I do that is because usually once they start that deep Fry singing Andrew Eldritchy voice, that's all they have the entire way through. It's very boring. It's the same voice all along. So I was a little worried when I first heard that voice start coming in. But then Ashton stretched his legs. So then you started getting some of the, he put some passion and emotion into it, like you were mentioning, KB, with the music theater thing, and some of that sort of yelping, those furious yops of sound that, I associate more with a Peter Murphy style singing, where he'd have the deep voice, but then he'd get emotionally passionate and his voice would go up, and there's little cracks in the voice that will come in to show the emotion and passion. So usually a lot of the singing is, you start a note low in a Fry register, and then you raise up, and then the passion builds, and you get to that upper register, and then your voice kind of cracks a little bit. So once Ashton started sort of stretching his legs and showing his vocal range, I really did start getting into it. And I did really start enjoying a lot of the tracks, but I was a little bit, like I said, a little bit worried at the very beginning, just listening to it when that voice first came in, because it was so similar to that voice that I like. I mean, I do like that generic goth voice. It just it becomes a crutch for a lot of bands, I think. Like, oh, this is the voice I have to do. Kind of like my same attitude towards a lot of black metal and death metal when they go into the Cookie Monster or the screamy voices.
The Cookie Monster.
It's like, yeah, the death metal Cookie Monster voice. When it's just that voice all the way through, it loses its power to me. It's like, it's great as an effect, it's great to evoke a certain emotion, but if the entire song, and then also if the entire album is done with the exact same voice, it no longer has a point. And some of those bands that get into this style that are sort of aping that Mission and Fields and Sisters of Mercy kind of style, they just key on that one thing and just stay through it the whole way through, and it just gets so fatiguing to me. But Ashton didn't do that, so that was a welcome relief when I was listening more and saw him get more into it. I didn't do a detailed breakdown of this like you did. I didn't do that with any of the albums. I mostly was just trying to listen. I listened to all of these albums multiple times. I basically had a big YouTube music playlist that I played back and forth in my car pretty regularly over the last month. So it was mostly listened to it on my car stereo, which is actually decent. But I did listen to it a little bit at home on my monitors and on my nice headphones too. So I kind of got a good feel for it in different ways. But yeah, I really did like this. I agree with you on what was it? Was it Where the Shadow Goes? The one that you thought was the sort of the
weaker one?
Yeah, the weaker one. Is that the one?
Yes, Where the Shadow Goes. Yeah. Yeah,
I agree with you on that one being where it kind of fell flat. I thought that was definitely a weaker one. When I started playing that, when you started talking before you even mentioned it, I'm like, oh yeah, this one was just meh. And then you started saying, yeah, and this one is where it finally fell flat. I'm like, oh, okay, we agree. That's great. So no, I definitely agree with that one. But yeah, I thought the rest of it, it's a solid album. I mean, I am familiar with The Awakening, but mostly because of the the Dark Romantic song, which a lot of people know.
Right.
That's my main touchstone for them. And I've heard them probably on playlists at goth clubs. I've probably heard them on comps, but they didn't grab me to the same degree. They weren't as formative for me, mostly because they came out. I mean, this band was out during, I guess a lot of the bands that both of you suggested were good and revelatory for me because sort of my gap years, I was big into the goth scene starting in about 95. And then it sort of waned about 2002 when I got married and was moving around and wasn't able to really be part of a scene. So I wasn't necessarily paying attention to the music as much. So there's this gap between like 2002 or 2004 and 2012 when I didn't really hear much of the music that was coming out at that time. And then after 2012, I started getting back into it when I moved to Chicago. I started going out regularly. And then, of course, joining you on the podcast here and definitely immersing myself in the scene again. It's been sort of neat to get this glimpse into that gap time because it was sort of both of your formative years was my empty time that I don't really know very well. So I was enjoying this sort of glimpse into that era. But yeah, I thought this was a really good album.
Oh, happy to hear that. All right, KB, what is your second album?
My next one is You'll Wake Up Yesterday by ThouShaltNot, which is originally from 2002, although I was introduced to this album in 2008, and there's a fun story about how I discovered it. So I was at Bats Day of 2008, and for some reason that year it was in November. So it was actually happening during Haunted Mansion Holiday. Yay, all these connections to me in my earlier conversation. Anyways, some people were randomly singing If I Only Were a Goth, and I was like, is that a real song? And they said, oh yeah. And so I looked it up on YouTube because YouTube was new at the time. And also kind of funny. I don't know if any of you remember. Well, I don't know. Trey might not because he's too old for this. But
Yeah,
there was that era of YouTube where people would make like fan videos. Usually it was like Disney villains or anime characters, and it would be to some alternative song, and it would be very dramatic. You know, they made the little AMVs.
Oh, I loved AMVs. I watched a ton of those.
So someone made actually an AMV with that song to If I Only Were a Goth with a bunch of Disney villains. I may even be able to find that video if I looked it up. They actually originally they misattributed it to Voltaire, which a lot of people have done by some.
That was a problem especially during the Napster years with bands being attributed to the wrong person.
Yeah, that was probably why. They probably got it off Napster, like how a bunch of people thought that song Not an Addict by Kay's Choice was by Fiona Apple. But that's anyway, different subject. So that's actually, this song being misattributed to him was actually how I discovered him originally, although I quickly realized that was a misattribution. Yeah. And so I went on iTunes because or maybe it wasn't until December, and I got an iTunes gift card for Christmas, and I downloaded the album, and that's how I discovered this album. And so I guess I listened. That was my junior year of high school, and that's when I listened to it then. Although I think even then I kind of tired of it a bit then, because most of the album was pretty different from that. And the way I describe this album is most of it, it's like spooky electronic. And if it was made nowadays, I think it would actually be quite timely. Because this is kind of how a lot of modern recent goth is that it's just sort of like one person and their synthesizer. And but this was the early 2000s, not the 2020s or late 2010s, so it wasn't quite there yet. And but most of that particular song was kind of silly. Most of the songs are actually kind of sad, and I remember for a while trying to figure out, like, is this pro-religion or anti-religion based on that, Without Faith song? And then my sister pointed out to me, she's like, they're called Thou Shalt Not. What do you think? And I'm like, oh yeah, that seems kind of anti. And it's like. So most of the songs were just about the person being a sad boy and having, like, religious trauma. And I was an angsty teenager, so that resonated with me at the time. But I was like, I'm not as into this electro stuff, really. And listening to it again, I'm like, okay, yeah, I see why I wasn't eventually was not as into this, because like I said, I think it's someone who he would have benefited from, like, waiting 10 years for technology to improve or something.
Yeah,
because it's like, yeah, I see what he was trying to do, but I don't think the resources existed. But now, like, we have all these, like, dark wave solo albums, and I think if this made now, it would have fit right in. So yeah, that's my story of how I discovered it, and I don't have the like every song breakdown.
That's
the
fine.
way.
That's fine.
Danny's the only one who's going to be doing
I
that,
overdid
think,
it,
so
but yeah.
that's okay.
Yeah, and it doesn't remind me of swimming in the ocean or anything. So
Yeah.
and I don't know. I liked that there was a painted black cover on it because I remember back then, for some reason, I discovered all these random painted black covers.
There's a lot.
Oh yeah.
That I don't know why that was I don't even think it was a 2000s thing specifically. It was just a ever since the original version came out thing. But during that particular era of my life, I was finding a bunch of covers of it. Like there was this one extreme techno cover, and then there was like the French version, which got popular because it was in Talladega Nights of all things.
There was even a Christian metal band that covered that song that I remember.
Oh,
weirdly.
wow.
So it was covered by everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was like, I think that it makes it fit into that era of my life of when I heard it, because that's when I was discovering a bunch of painted black covers, but I don't think it makes it to that specific era in general, because obviously people have been covering that song since it came out.
This is one of the more unique covers of it, though.
Yes,
this was
definitely.
a very, very interpretive cover of Painted Black.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's something that is very interesting, I guess, that did kind of make him stand out, is that it was a very sort of simplistic electro sound, but then there was also times where he was trying to sound, very emotive and melodic. So, but yeah, as far as how did I think it held up, I really think the Jill Tracey one held up a lot for me. This one, I think from the way I've been talking about it, it's a little obvious that to me personally, this one, it didn't hold up as much to me.
Mm-hmm.
So,
that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think listening to it now.
Yes. So, what did you think of it?
Yeah, I actually have a cute little story about this as well. It's actually, so it's weird that I've never listened to this album before, because I had heard If I Only Was a Goth, probably it was maybe 2007, 2008, and I heard it, there was a music festival called Cornerstone that took place in central Illinois, and it was this huge festival that, so it's a Christian music festival, again, going back to this time in my life. But it attracted maybe 30,000 people every year. And I would go and camp out, and it was a week or so long. And one of the years, that going back to seminal goth moments, that was when I first discovered other goths, because the second year I went, I discovered there was a tent called the Asylum.
Oh.
And it was a goth tent, and that was this moment where I walked in, and I had never seen I'd never been to a goth club or anything, but I walked in and there were tables covered in lace and crushed velvet, and there were men wearing skirts, and there were people wearing veils over their faces and smoking black cigarettes, and there were candelabras, and I was like, what is happening? This is the most incredible thing. I feel like I've come home. I feel like I finally belong somewhere. This is what I've been looking for. So that tent, they had DJ nights, and it was, they played Christian, industrial, and goth music, but there was a night where they played that song. And I remember that song specifically because it made such an impact on me, because I realized, first of all, it stood out, because it's a comedy, it's a comedy song, but also it stood out from everything else that was being played. And also it was obviously directly talking to, I knew it was a joke song, but it was also if I'm a goth, because obviously I was trying to figure out how can I be a goth? I'm trying to fit myself into this thing that I don't know anything about because of my situation. But I'm the lyrics are talking about all these things that I don't understand. So I'm going around to people asking, like, badly pronouncing Einstünstende Neubauten, and asking, do you know what this is? Like, what is this thing? And they're like, I don't know. It's just as cool as a goth thing. Or I think somebody was like, I think it's a band. And so I'm like mentally trying to take notes of all the references in this song, realizing like, I think this is supposed to be important. If I want to be a real goth, I should know what these things are.
This means something.
So yeah. And so this was cool to finally sit down and listen to this album. And now, having had Alex on the podcast before and having read his book and like having respect for him as an academic and like scene historian, gives interesting context to this. So for me, like, this album was full of surprises because you get like what I think would be considered a breakbeat on We're in This Together, which is really interesting.
Almost every track.
Yeah. Well, that was like the first one that came up, so that's why I wrote it down.
I'll touch on that in my review. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, fair enough. So I don't really hear that in other bands, so that was like interesting and kind of fun for me. And then at the end of that song, you get this acoustic breakdown, which was also completely unexpected. And then, but you do get, it does, again, going back to what you were saying, KB, it does also kind of sound dated because, like, you kind of tell it's from 2002, where the synth sounds just of its time.
Yes.
But some of the tracks, like the bass, sounds kind of hollow to me. And it just, it sounds like it's like on an older computer or something like that.
Yeah. Like, it's like someone mastered it using like that one Garage Band.
Yeah.
Does anyone remember that program?
GarageBand still exists. It's one of the more popular ones on the Mac platform, but it is Mac only.
Yeah,
I'll touch on a lot of that.
GarageBand as it was back then.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Or whatever the precursor. I don't know if GarageBand was around in 2002.
It was.
But
like,
I'm pretty sure it was.
On the song Crash, which I did like, because you get this long lead in with this reserved piano, and then eventually you get this like glitchy, weird electronic layer over top of it. But again, it feels like it's limited by the hardware. And maybe, for some people it might be appealing because it is again, going back to an era. So there's always going to be some people where it's like, this is the nostalgia. This is like a thing that I like. So I like that sound. But for me, it just kind of sounded dated. I was really surprised how much of the album is either acoustic guitar or primarily piano with singing over the top of it. I don't know how that was received at the time. I don't know if maybe there was more of an audience for that with like the popularity of Project Records. But I don't think we get too many bands doing that kind of thing. There are definitely bands that do that now, but I don't think it's as like super popular. The other criticism I would have that I'll turn into a positive, but I can't not mention it, is that Alex has the weakest vocals of the albums we've talked about. I don't think I can get around not mentioning that. They aren't bad. I just think they're average. And I think they just suffer in comparison to the vocalists we've been listening to. I will say, though, to turn it into a positive, that the later albums from ThouShaltNot, and more specifically releases from Seeming, Alex's current band, his vocals have markedly improved by leaps and bounds. Even like the comedy songs. He recently put out a song called Gothic Yard Sale, which is fucking hilarious. Probably gonna use it on the Gothquisition. Just like from a comedy song, like not a serious song, the vocal performances are miles apart. So he's definitely improved, but yeah, the vocals are on this album they're fine, they're serviceable, but they're not anything great. I think the album is still, for what he's working with, still complex. It's diverse musically from track to track. I think if you are, especially of the time, but even now, if you're looking for an album to hold your attention and give you something a little bit different, it's a decent album to go with. Scales on Scales is a good example of that, I think, as a song. It has this, like, I don't know if it would be salsa-infused beat to it.
I think it's rumba, but it's definitely a Latin beat. I think rumba. I saw a review that said it was tango, and it's definitely not tango, but at least they were in the right hemisphere. But yeah, I'm pretty sure it's a Latin. It's definitely a Latin beat. It's got the standard, the standard beat from a lot of those Latin dance musics.
So that's how I feel about it. And then I guess my the only other thing I thought of was, I did think it was interesting how many song titles have brackets, and I don't know if that's a artistic or philosophical reference, if it's like a reference to Cut Up or something, but I bet there's some story there. I had to point it out because somebody must know the answer to that, but I just thought it was interesting. Not somebody here, but somebody out in the world must have an answer.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
All right, what'd you think,
cool.
Trey?
So when I started listening to this, I mean, like I did with all the other bands, I kind of did a little research ahead of time, and I saw that Alex Reed was behind ThouShaltNot. I'd heard of ThouShaltNot, and I definitely heard the If I Only Were a Goth. That's the only song that reading the title, I knew exactly what it was. I knew the song. I could sing bits of it. Beyond that, I wasn't that familiar. I know I'd heard them because I recognized the artist name from various playlists at clubs I've been to, but it never really stuck in my head as, I really want to check out this particular band. It just sort of fit in with the rest of whatever was being played that night. So I was kind of interested because I did really like Alex Reed's book, Assimilate, and the depth of his knowledge of the industrial subgenre, at least, and all that. So I kind of came into this with high hopes, as sort of industrial album. And the first listen through it was painful. And all the things that have already been mentioned. The singing quality is poor, but it was just exacerbated by the fact that the production quality is so bad that there's no consistency of the levels between the various instruments. Sometimes it'd be a really heavy, really loud bass, then sometimes the vocals would be really loud, but it wouldn't be consistent. It didn't seem to gel together. It seemed like a bunch of different ingredients just kind of thrown together on top of each other to make songs.
Yeah.
And then also, as you mentioned, the breakbeat, I kind of, after listening to it the first time all the way through, I'm like, all right, so this album is Alex discovers the breakbeat and puts it on every song.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of it was the standard breakbeats. There was nothing exotic in there. He had definitely Amen break, which is one of the most common ones, a couple of times in there, and a couple others that were pretty bog standard breaks that everybody knows and everybody uses. So that was my first listen through, and it was a little bit painful. So I did a little bit of research into the band and, the time it was out. And one thing I can speak to, you were both mentioning the production and the sort of start of the solo producer and how today it's become so common for these bedroom producers to release amazing albums. This era, the beginning of the 2000s, the early noughties, was kind of the start of that whole thing. KB, you already mentioned GarageBand. That was one of the first ones on the Mac side. On the PC side, which is where I was living at the time, and I was also doing a little bit of bedroom producing because this was right after college. I took some music production and composition classes in college. I was getting into music. I used Sony Acid, which was loop-based. Both of them were loop-based environments. So this was the start of loop sample CDs, loop-based production, where you just buy sample CDs that had chopped up loops that could just play over and over and over again, and you compile songs by just piling those on top of each other. The funny thing about that era, though, since I was doing the production at the time and was kind of buying some of those sample CDs and listening to them, when you start listening to music of that era, you start hearing the same samples everywhere. because there were only so
Yeah,
many
that
of
makes
those
sense.
main sample CDs.
Yeah.
And I definitely heard some ones that I recognized in the Thou Shalt Not. So that was kind of fun, a little callback to sort of me just getting into the music production thing the first time. So I think a lot of that's related. So it's going to be not necessarily the technology like you were saying, Danny, but I think it's practice on how to properly balance things. It's more than just throwing. You can't just take the samples off of these CDs and put them together because they sound good, kind of good together. When you pile enough of them on, you need to learn how to EQ them and balance them and put effects on them to make them gel together, rather than to feel like a bunch of disparate things just sort of being piled on top of one another. And I don't think Alex was at that point yet.
I'm glad you said it, because I was like, I like Alex. I don't want, yeah, no, you're 100% right.
Well,
I didn't want to be too critical, but yeah, I completely agree.
I mean, if he's still going now, I assume this was pretty early in his musical career.
It is.
Because I haven't really followed what he's done since, so
that was the next thing I was going to say. When I first was listening to this and went through it, I was immediately thinking, I bet this is one of his first albums. It turns out it's technically the third album, but it was an EP, and it was an EP that was a compilation of like B-sides from the first two albums. So it was a bunch of tracks that he'd composed at the beginning of his career that didn't really fit into the first two albums as a cohesive album. So they were just sort of compiled as separate little pieces, and then he just put them all out as this EP. With probably the main touchstone being the If I Only Were a Goth, because that was the really popular one that most people know. So it really was meant to be kind of a B-sides collection, which are always, it's rough. But the main thing on repeated listens to this, I was able to kind of look beyond the rough production, look beyond the fact that the rough production was really emphasizing in a negative way any weaknesses in vocal technique or mic technique or recording technique on vocals. And this was before auto-tune, so there were points where he was in and out of tune a little bit. Or at least before it was commonly used. It did exist at this point, but it was like a really expensive studio tool, not something that anybody could use. So there wasn't any way to fix tuning. So if you weren't perfectly on tune, you just dealt with it, or you kept recording your vocals over and over and over again until you got it right. So yeah, there was a lot of that in and out, but I was able to look past that. And what I then saw was sort of a creative flourishing, a creative mind at work, or even I would say almost more a creative mind at play. Someone with a lot of knowledge of music and a lot of knowledge of different styles of music, trying to throw stuff together to find out what worked and what gelled and what would create a sound. So it did give me the feeling of a band discovering its voice, or in this case, an artist, since it is a single artist that's, making this, but that artist discovering their voice. So just kind of throwing a bunch of things at the wall and seeing what sticks, and then developing that. Yeah. And I think I definitely am planning on listening to more later albums of Thou Shalt Not, because I did really there were some amazingly good ideas in here. There are little snippets, little bits and pieces of these songs that were like, oh, that's a really good idea. It's got a lot of other stuff around it that needs to be trimmed away. It needs to be polished. It needs to be trimmed and cut and refined to make it a cohesive piece. But this core idea is there, and this core idea is interesting. So that's what I really got to it, is I really did think it was good and really did think it was interesting. And also, combined with my knowledge of Alex Reed's writing and this other stuff there, once I did confirm that this Alex Reed was the same Alex Reed that wrote Assimilate, because I wasn't 100% sure. I'd been fooled by that in the past, where I read, I recognize that name, and I know them for this. Nope, totally different person, same name. But I did verify when I looked up Assimilate and said, Assimilate, also known as the founder of the band Thou Shalt Not. Oh, okay, great, okay. So I can make that comment now. So knowing his knowledge of the music history and the music genres and all that, I definitely do want to give them more of a second chance. And, I have a soft spot for the excessive use of breakbeats. I'm a big fan of breakbeats personally. I love drum and bass. I love jungle music. I like a good breakbeat. And when I was doing music production, I would still play with it on occasion now as well. But when I was getting into it at that time, I was all about the breakbeats then too. So I was throwing them into everything, and I liked my, drum and bass and big beats and jungle music. So I totally sympathize with this. Let's put breakbeats on everything impulse. That really categorized that first listen. So yeah, I would have to say, as a whole, as an album, if this was the only album, no interest in it at all. It's not a good album, but it is a good sign of an artist that has a really interesting voice, and once they polish and refine it, can make amazing albums. So that's why I definitely want to look into the later things. And I have heard some Seeming, and I do like Seeming. So yeah, I definitely want to listen to some of the later ThouShaltNot. So knowing that this was an early album of his, and that it was kind of a B-sides album as well, that definitely says, oh yeah, it's exactly what I thought it was. And it bodes well for the rest of the career.
Would I like another clove? Well, sure. All right, we've got one album left, and that is
technically two. We've got one of mine and one of yours.
Oh yeah, you've got one. Oh fuck. Okay, yeah. Sorry. What's yours? Yeah, you. Yeah, no, you're right. You were next then.
Medieval Baebes.
I am.
Medieval Oh yes. How did I forget?
Salva Nos by the Medieval Baebes. So this was another. I mean, it's not quite as. I guess I can't say it's quite as totally of its times as My Scarlet Life is, but it is definitely of its times. There was a big trend in the mid to late 90s of chant music. Became very popular. I mean, Enigma everybody knows, but there were a bunch of other bands that put chant music on top of other things or did chant covers and things like that. So when I was doing a little bit of research on Medieval Baebes, I did find a lovely little quote that I liked from their webpage. They said, "Medieval Baebes began when a group of friends broke into a cemetery and sang together, clad in flowing white gowns and crowns of ice." I thought that was a great little quote. So this is another one of those, as you mentioned with the previous one, it's definitely goth adjacent. It's not directly goth, but it's got some deep roots in goth, kind of like My Scarlet Life does. And it did get played in my local goth scene. I definitely played it. But then I was also known when I was DJing as someone who just played stuff that wasn't necessarily in the genre, but fit the mood. I was more about the mood and the ambiance than caring about what genre things are. So if it was something that was out of genre, but it seemed to flow with the other tracks and develop the sort of ambiance and mood that I was going for, that I was crafting, I would throw it in there. And we had a few people that were of like-minded nature in the Champaign-Urbana scene in Central Illinois, which is where I had my goth awakening. So, and that's part of probably why I developed that taste, is because we did have a lot of other DJs that weren't so I guess caught up in must play stuff that is appropriately goth or in the genre, and they would play stuff that just like, oh, this sounds like it fits and it sounds really cool, and I want to introduce people to this cool thing. So as mentioned, this is very much, as the name implies, medieval music inspired album. The whole band was medieval inspired. The band was founded by Catherine Blake, who, as I kind of hinted at earlier, was initially the lead vocalist and songwriter for Miranda Sex Garden.
Yeah. So
that was their original foundation, musically speaking. And Miranda Sex Garden... Go on.
Sorry. Was she the one who was romantically involved with Alan Wilder at some point?
I think maybe. I didn't really look into it that much, but I know there was some stuff about romantic involvement, but I don't necessarily pay attention to
because that's actually how I originally heard of Miranda Sex Garden, because she was Alan Wilder of Depeche Mode's baby mama. So
it's possible that I don't know.
But yeah, someone in that band. I don't know if it's her.
Yeah. And of course, Miranda Sex Garden is relatively well known within the goth music circles.
Yeah.
And they did have a few albums that pulled in those medieval music elements. They had a whole album earlier mid-career that was like medieval madrigals. And then when they kind of at least broke up for a time in the mid-90s, that's when Catherine went out and founded Medieval Baebes. Just grabbed a bunch of friends and created this band that really wanted to double down on this sort of delving into traditional medieval European musics. They really did focus more on chant because it was made up of a bunch of female vocalists primarily with less instrumentalists, but they have a mix. It's a lot of chant, but they also have some that were more, like madrigals or plain song or stuff that you might hear in a tavern rather than just in a monastery or a convent, I guess would be more appropriate for this group. So this album itself, I was probably one of my earlier introductions to the idea of chant music a little bit. I'd kind of gotten into it before, but it was mostly like part of that 90s, let's put chant in with techno beats thing that Enigma and bands like that fostered. And then, of course, bands like Gregorian, which did the chant covers of popular songs, which I always found very fun. But this was the first kind of serious chant album. It's not my first introduction because I definitely came up listening to classical music. Was one of my foundational musics as a child before I even got into goth at all. I definitely listened to a lot of classical and radio stuff, and that was kind of my baseline. So I'd heard classical choral music, but a lot of that even still didn't focus on medieval chant. It was more, choral music that you get with Beethoven or with Wagner, things like that. That would be part of an opera or part of an operetta, things like that, which is a very different style from chant. So this was sort of my first introduction to kind of legitimate chant music from the church tradition, from the tradition of the monks and nuns that would do that within the convent as a way of deepening their relationship with God and religion and all that stuff. And just as a musical outlet, that's where I was discovering, Hildegard von Bingen, who was one of the greatest composers of chant music, the mystic nun that composed thousands upon thousands of chants and is very well known and, had visions and very sort of the mystical side of Christianity, less the very rigid church base, but more the visions and mystical prophecy and all that stuff.
I can get down with that.
I definitely gravitated towards that. So this is sort of my introduction to that sort of side of music, and I really did enjoy it. It was played by a couple of the DJs at our clubs, and that's probably where I first heard it. So actually, I probably first heard it not at a club. Part of our scene, we had one member of our scene, Jason, who was also known as the Goth Priest. He is legitimately a priest now. And he was either going through seminary at the time or something like that, but he's a priest now. He also writes for White Wolf and is a big, he's done some modules for, I think, Wraith is one of his main focuses within the White Wolf world of darkness. So he does that in addition to being a sort of Orthodox Christian. He doesn't really have a good denomination, but he tends to be along the more conservative Christian, but not necessarily in the, I guess, bad American sense that one normally thinks of when you hear conservative Christian, but more just traditionalist when it comes to Christian orthodoxy. So that tends to be his focus, but he, of course, doesn't carry over some of the bigoted aspects that you usually associate with that sort of thing, because he definitely hung out with our crowd, and we had a mix of gay and straight. I mean, the club wasn't a gay club, just as par for the course, which is not that unusual for goth clubs in general. When we have to share a space, it's oftentimes in a space that is alternative subcultures of multiple different ways, and alternative sexuality is definitely one of the major ones. Yeah. So, I mean, he was very open. He was never very preachy. He was a great guy. He's a good friend. So I'm still connected to him. I haven't spoken with him for a few years now, and I may want to reach out to him at some point to see how he's doing. Though I follow him on Facebook. But he had a show on our local college radio station that played chant music. And he did take that very loosely. It wasn't all like Gregorian chant. It wasn't all Christian chant. He would play Coptic chants. He would play Tuvan throat music. who do Hindu chants, and he definitely played medieval Baebes, and that's probably where I first heard them. And then it just dug down the rabbit hole of chant music and got into Hildegard von Bingen and Gregorian and all that other stuff at the time. And then, of course, when I started DJing, I would throw things in tracks as well. I think on this album, let's see, what track did I tend to play the most? It might have been either Gaudete or Adam Leabounden. Those I tended to play in some of my sets. But the other thing that this album has are two of my very, very favorite versions of Coventry Carol and Veni Emmanuel, which are some of my favorite Christmas carols. Yeah. Some of those traditional Christmas carols. And the reason I like them versus the traditional one is these are, as the sort of tagline says, of breaking into a cemetery, these are really slowed down and are almost funerary. Like more of a requiem mass rather than sort of bright, fast, Christmassy tempo. I mean, the older Christmas hymns are darker just in general than your, Jingle Bells and the sort of modern Christmas canon. So I always did gravitate towards those when it comes to Christmas music, though I am a lover of Christmas music in general. But yeah, the versions they do of those two songs are, as far as I'm concerned, the canonical version of those songs. And it's hard for me to hear other versions because I'm like, you're singing it wrong. You're either going too fast or they don't cut the syllables right. It's just, so those are kind of my canonical versions of the song. So I loved this album when I listened to it. It's been a long time, but listening to it again, this one totally stands up, despite being of its era because chant was popular. I mean, chant music is timeless. It's been something that we've had with us for hundreds of years, and it may come in and out of fashion, but I think the music itself is timeless and beautiful. So this album definitely held up. I still loved it. I would love diving back into it and listening to it again. Yeah, so that's my review of this album.
Nice.
People keep saying there's going to be like a 90s goth music revival because we had the 80s goth music revival. Maybe we'll get the chance again.
Maybe. That'd be nice.
So the Medieval Baebes is another band I'd actually heard of because so like my dad and my sister my whole family is sort of into like Celtic music. And I grew up going to the Scottish Festival in Costa Mesa a lot, so I knew a lot of like modern folk rock Celtic-y bands. So which is sort of adjacent to that.
Yep.
And then, so my dad and then sort of my sister, especially, both of them like a lot of like Celtic-y stuff. So once, I think on Pandora, my sister got recommended the Medieval Baebes, and then she told my dad about them. So that's the connection there. And I do think this is sort of like, an era thing because the sort of like chanty, I guess it's sort of like tribal in a different way because I was talking about the tribal thing earlier being sort of a 90s thing. But I don't know, tribal as like religious tribal, I don't know.
It's oftentimes grouped in with quote unquote problematic as it may be world musics.
Yes.
It tends to be played in the same sort of things. It tends to go together. Yeah. So I totally see where you're associating the two.
I mean, the term tribal is kind of problematic. It's like, what is tribal? What is?
Yes.
Because like people hear that and they usually think of like tribal in a like non-Western sense, but like, but I don't know. Sometimes people also include just like pre-Christian Europe anyways. But this is obviously post because it's inspired more by sort of the nun and monastic traditions. Which I was also familiar with because, I don't know, my dad randomly had this CD of Gregorian chants. So, like, although, I don't know, I can't really hear, like, monk or nun type of chanty stuff without thinking of the scene from, like, Monty Python and the Holy Oh, you already knew I was going to say that. Okay. Have people made that connection to them before?
Not really, but I could kind of feel where you were going, and I actually just watched a reaction video on that movie a few weeks ago.
Okay. So, yeah, that's sort of my personal connection to that, and like, Well, it's not my personal favorite thing, but it was fun for me because because I have that like connection. It's like, oh, it makes me think of family stuff, but in a good.
It takes you back.
Yeah.
Yes. Even though, like, well, the medieval Baebes I specifically didn't find out about until recently, but things that were related to them I knew about earlier.
Okay.
So yeah, because like I mentioned, like my sister heard about them from Pandora. Although now that's like a dated way to listen to music, even so. Everyone's on Spotify.
So I had Einstürzende Neubauten play for me on Pandora when I looked up when I was playing a playlist based on lounge music, which was fun.
That's very weird.
It actually did fit the song they picked.
Okay.
Okay.
It might have been In Blume or one of those, but it was one of those sort of songy numbers. But yeah, it was odd when Einstürzende Neubauten appeared when I was looking for when I based it on like Esquivel and lounge acts from the 50s.
But yeah, well, I think my sister got recommended the Medieval Baebes when she put in Enya on Pandora. So
totally makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Because it's like not quite, but I see it's related. It's part of like the new age music movement, I guess, which I'm sure some people. Is that term still used for music?
Yes, it is.
It is? Okay.
Huh? Yep. New age. There's still new age music that's released. It is still considering sort of an easy listening elevator music kind of genre. Like it kind of always has been. It's always been a music genre that's been given a lot of shit, really.
Yeah.
It's not well regarded among quote unquote serious music listeners. I'm mixed on
not
it.
us.
Yeah, I'm mixed on it. I do like some new age, but some new age can get a little bit self-indulgent. I mean, frankly, going back to Preston Click, his current occupation, he still releases music, but he does holistic sound bath.
Oh yeah,
So gong music and that sort of thing, which is along those new agey lines. It's used in yoga studios.
On TikTok, also, I get those when I'm stoned for some reason.
Okay.
Those always show up on
That's fair. I can see that.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Did you have more to say, KB?
No, I was mostly gonna say it's sort of like, I don't know, reminds me of those sorts of things. It's like Enya adjacent, but like more seriously, like more connected to the original sound.
Yeah, more grounded in the tradition, less floaty, high reverb.
Yes. Which I think is part of why a lot of like quote unquote new age music does have more of that element, because of it's like, well, nowadays it's mostly like meditation music, whereas this was like, no, let's go back. We're going to be chanting nuns.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had known, I haven't heard this album. I knew of the band just because I've listened to them like on the way to the Renaissance Fair or whatever.
Okay.
Apparently this album was pretty big though, because on Wikipedia it said that it was certified silver in 1998, and the album spent 8 weeks in the UK top 100 album chart, peaking at 62. So I guess they got pretty popular.
Popular appeal, yeah.
And well, speaking of the Renaissance Fair, it is Renaissance Fair season in the Midwest, but it doesn't need to be that time of year to enjoy and appreciate this lush genre. And I am a sucker for this niche, whatever the media, whether it's, any fantasy stuff. And, I think whether you're reading a book, a fantasy novel, or playing a video game, or watching a medieval TV show, it's always the music that makes or breaks the immersion for me. You have to have like some lute-based music or whatever. The ambiance hinges on the world coming together through the magic of the music. And this is such a
lute-based music for your lute-based shooter.
Yeah. And I toot through the lute that is up
your
my
boot.
This is a gorgeous album.
I had a feeling there was going to be a video game reference when we got to this album. I just knew it was going to happen.
I mean, I played so many games that The Witcher 3 came to mind initially, but like so many fantasy games, this would fit right into low fantasy, high fantasy, whatever. you know, and going back to my weird sort of emotional way of experiencing music, this album made me feel so many feels. It's like, you know, some tracks made me want to throw on a cloak and grab a traveling bag and a walking stick and a loaf of bread and head out on an adventure like a hobbit. Some tracks made me want to visit the local pub for a pint and a story by the fire. Some tracks made me want to wander the forest at twilight to watch the procession of the elves. There's meditative tracks that I would definitely use for like grounding before practicing magic. Like, for example, I always listen to Under the Greenwood Tree by Estampy for specific rituals that I do. So this would like definitely be something that I would use. There's songs on here for bread and jam and apples at elevensies. Like you were mentioning, Trey, there's classics like the versions of Gaudette and Veni Veni on here. It's not goth at all, I don't think, but I love this kind of shit. I mean, I could definitely see it being played in a club. You know, just going back to when I would DJ, I would try and mix in stuff with medieval or classical influence in it. If it wasn't like straight up something like this, it would be like a going back to Attrition, like there's a Attrition song, I Am Eternity, that was remixed by Chris and Cozy that I would play because it has like there's an electronic remix part to it, but there's also like this sort of medieval aspect to it. And, you know, I just loved listening to the artistry of the vocals. When I was like 7, 8, 9, 10, and a little bit here and there when I got older, I was singing in a lot of church choirs, and I enjoyed it for a while. I remember being really, really excited when on the few occasions I would get like a solo or something. But as I got older, it was just, I didn't enjoy singing, doing like the Christmas carols or the dry Abrahamic, like shitty music that we were doing in church and that kind of thing. And if I had seen like, oh yeah, you can do weird stuff like this or off-kilter things and knew that I could pursue in high school, like pursue this kind of music in some capacity, like that would have been wonderful for me. I probably would have tried to do singing more in some form. You know, there's just late. Well, yeah, I don't know. There's something about a hurdy-gurdy and a flute. And I don't know if they used hurdy-gurdy at all, but I like the word hurdy-gurdy, so I'm going to say it anyway.
It's a good word. It's a good word.
You know, and worshiping a pagan pantheon, that really awakened something in me. And I appreciate, you know, you kind of mentioned this when you sent me the album, Trey, but this kind of music specifically, like I mentioned, because I use like Estampy and some other bands in ritual and stuff, I will listen to it when I'm having a panic attack as well, because it does help kind of shift my conscious thought in a bit of a different direction and take a bit of the edge off and shift my mindset to a different place a bit.
Good.
So I thoroughly enjoyed the album, and I don't have a lot to say to break down the music or anything. It was just really a calming, peaceful, lovely experience. So yeah, I mean, I love this kind of shit. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought you might.
Okay. So, then the last album is
the 18 Angels.
Yes. So, One of 18 Angels by Diary of Dreams. I don't have, this will be definitely way quicker than my last one. I don't have any personal anecdotes about the band, other than just now that I'm thinking about it, my dad must have been, I can only imagine what he was thinking when I was in our garage singing I Need My Chemicals when I was like 17. I don't know what he thought I was singing about, but this album came out the same year as the Fourth Seal of Zen by The Awakening, which was what I mentioned before that had the dark romantics on it. But I did not hear this until way later in my life. I don't know exactly when it was. It was sometime in high school, but probably late high school. And that was just because it wasn't a Christian album, so I didn't have access to it. So all I can share really is a little information about the band, which is that the band was started in the 80s by the lead singer Adrian, who is a classically trained guitarist and former member of the band Garden of Delight, which is the German band, not the band from Norway. Those are two different bands with the same name. So
that's like looking up Covenant.
Yeah. But the first album was released in 1994. And in his bio, he said he lived on a large quantity of land where he had to run 20 minutes to get from one building to another, which started his appreciation for loneliness. And I think that's absolutely something you can hear in the compositions on this album. So, Rumors About Angels opens and closes with a sample from the movie Dark City, which
that's what it's from.
I haven't seen, and I was hoping I would watch it before we recorded this episode, and I still haven't watched it yet. So I don't know if you've seen it, KB. Trey, have you seen it?
Yes.
Is it a good movie? Okay.
It's been a while, but it's a good movie.
But yeah, it sets the tone for the album. The audio clip sets the tone for the track, which is slow and plodding. And this song was one of the earlier songs that turned me on to this style of goth music, because it's a goth rock track, but it's slowed down and heavy on atmosphere. And to this day, my favorite goth tracks, regardless of genre, are going to be heavy on atmosphere and often slower. Not as a rule, but oftentimes I like those. And the whole album is dripping with that dark, foreboding, heavy sort of velvet night sky ambiance. And actually, Adrian is quoted as saying, "I hate happy songs, they bore me to death." So we get a lot of that on this album. Butterfly Dance takes a sharp turn in that it focuses on dark electronics rather than the gothic rock of the previous track. This band, I think, has a lot in common with The Awakening, in that both bands have a heavy focus on lyrics and storytelling, and you can clearly hear what's being said. There's a poeticism to the lyrics, kind of reminiscent of 18th century or Victorian writers. They're very dark musically and very talented vocalists, although I think I have some critiques of the vocals on this album I'll get to. And the two bands I think are complementary in some ways that kind of speak to where I was coming into myself as a goth early on, which was this flair for the dark romanticism and shadowy sort of vibe, taking myself way too seriously as a 19 and 20-year-old kid. As you do when you're 19 or 20. Guess, yeah. But this song is still a dance floor banger, in my opinion. Not in the four on the floor kind of way, but like in the similar way that I think, Trey, you would describe. But for me, like, if I were to envision a goth dance floor, which is a like a slow, melancholic, lace and drama-filled dance floor. So if I was able to craft my perfect goth club night, this track would be on the list, Butterfly Dance. Mankind is the next song. It blends the electronic elements of the previous track with this lovely meandering guitar that's reminiscent of 90s goth rock. And at times there's this arpeggiated synth that also sounds like a violin that's also kind of straight out of the 90s. And this is one of those Diary of Dream tracks that I think is more of a vehicle for Adrian's lyrics more than anything. And that happens pretty often with their songs, where the music kind of takes more of a back seat, and the lyrics are presented as the forefront, kind of inviting the listener to sing along, I think, which might make the track weaker for some or more enjoyable for others, depending on what you're into. Winter Souls now. Winter Souls. I think this song, Winter Souls, is a pretty uniquely Diary of Dreams sounding. You get this sound effect that sounds like a howling ghost Halloween decoration from the 60s, which is pretty great. And this blend of guitar and synth that works for me in a way that, like, 90% of bands that try and blend guitar and synth doesn't. It's almost like it almost sounds like an Assemblage 23 song at times, because it has this more like slowed down vibe. It's avant-garde in a way. You get some tempo changes and some vocal effects that keep it interesting. Nobody Left to Blame is the next song. I don't know if I can break down, well, I probably can't really break down the composite parts of the synth because there's so much going on this song. It just reminds me of, it makes me think of a like Chorus of the Damned or Music for the Vampires. It's like this, it's dark in this Halloween kind of way without being kitschy or campy. Not that that's bad, but it pulls off being serious without being laughable, and then it has this hypnotic beat as a backbone that all kind of crescendo into each other before collapsing into just a chorus of voices at the end that gives me the chills when I listen to it. I really like that song. And then Chemicals, which is the song I referenced, that has these great lyrics with like where he's saying, "I'm a full moon fever, I'm a non-believer, and I need my chemicals." I think this was probably the song I listened to the most when I was younger because the chorus on this track has that great melodic hook that's really reminiscent of kind of a synth pop thing.
You know, when you read those lyrics, it made me wonder whether that was somewhat inspired by David Bowie's Moonage Daydream.
Yeah, I don't know.
Because it has a similar sort of cadence and theme, I guess. Just an interesting aside.
Yeah. And then they managed to work in the electric guitar in a way that makes the song sound better. Which isn't like that's the whole album, but a lot of bands, I just don't like the way they blend electronics with like heavy rock guitar, and I just love the way they do it in Diary of Dreams, and it's always catchy and dancey as hell. The next track is Babylon. I think it breaks up the album in a meaningful way. It introduces kind of what are like post-punk guitars and this synth line that almost sounds like it was plucked from a Terror EBM track, which is interesting. You get these booming arena rock breakdowns that really open up the drums. And there's some synth lines that sound like they're straight out of a sci-fi movie or a game like Mass Effect. It's great, but it also is where I felt like this album is probably going to start to drag for some people because the tracks are all pretty long, and depending on your temperament, can be a bit oppressive and can kind of start to feel a bit samey. So I feel like some people are gonna like start dropping off the album by this point. Colorblind is a bit of a romantic track and kind of a hopeful track. You get synthesized strings and some piano, and it's just generally more uplifting and positive. I think the synth does sound a bit dated here because you get this kind of soap opera effect on the atmospheric portions of the track, and it does feel kind of cheesy in a way that it doesn't have to be a bad thing, but in the context of the song and the album where they are playing it straight and they are going for a serious kind of ballad, because the synth sounds more like a Casio keyboard at times, it just makes it kind of ruins the song, because it's like if I'm almost like chuckling but you're trying to make it a serious song, it kind of I don't think that's what you want, right? Song after that is People's Watcher, which is the first track to me that really just sounds generic. There's nothing new that they add, and even like subtly here, the synth lines sound reused. It's not a bad song. I don't think. I think the lyrics are still good. The vocals are still enjoyable, although I would argue that compared to an album like The Awakening, I think Ashton was still doing interesting things with his voice all the way through. And while I do love Adrian's voice, he just very much stays in his range, and it works for him. You just notice through the course of a long album like this that he's in the same place, kind of like a rut. Now on this song he does do some spoken word, which to his credit does add something to the track, but it's not, he doesn't have as much range. And then Darker is the next song. It's enjoyable, doesn't really do much to distinguish itself, and again points to the fact that the second half of the album kind of falls off. Not that it becomes a bad album, but I think it keeps it from reaching that cult status that it could have from like a 10 out of 10 kind of level album, which is a shame, I think, because I love the first half of this album, or the first third even of this album, so much that it makes it more disappointing in a way. And then Dead Souls Dreaming is, I think, a good end to the album. It's appropriately dramatic and disconcerting. It also has that movie soundtrack feel to it that fits back in with the sample from the first track. It feels like it would fit into like some kind of indie film. It's sort of disorienting and melodramatic, and brings back around some of my favorite things about the band. So overall, I did like the album. It really, more than anything, made me want to go look through their other discography and the albums after 2000, because there is so much greatness on this album that I want to see what they did. Like, I've listened to the other preceding music from them, but I haven't. There's big chunks of their music that I have not heard. So this made me really want to see, like, there's so much good here. I think they could really develop this and do some great stuff. So that's really what it made me feel. But still, like, fantastic band, fantastic, really unique sound, again, within this, talking about like the gothic rock arena, and especially even within the modern gothic rock bands that are coming out. I think this still, if you had not heard this band, but you were listening to goth rock bands today and you went back and listened to this album, I think this would add an interesting dimension to the genre for you. So still a good album and worth checking out for sure. Especially the first half is a banger, I think.
For some reason, the word that like came to mind when I was listening to it was like spacey.
Yeah, I think that loneliness, that emptiness to it does have that. Yeah.
Yeah, because Well, especially because I don't know some of the electronic stuff, but it wasn't like, alien sound, but just had like it had a space in general sound.
Yeah.
But I don't know, it was something that I thought was like the vocals were almost surprising because of the way it's initially sounded. I'm like, oh, it's another deep voice guy.
Yeah.
I don't know why I expected something different, but I was like, huh. I mean, it worked, but it was like, I feel like this type of music usually has a different sound of vocals, or at least it did at some point.
There's an association with sort of the spacey sound with usually a higher voice singer, oftentimes an ethereal female in your Enya vein.
Yes.
But sometimes a higher male, like a high tenor doing a falsetto or something like that.
That should be one of the goth types. You've got romantic goth, trad goth, deep voice guy.
Yes. There's the deep voice guy, and then there's the like high pitched like dude who But this was
your Peter Steele and your Robert Smiths.
Yes. But this was another deep voiced guy, and but yeah, I don't know. I feel like I don't have anything new to add because I was like, some of the like electronic sounds were a bit dated, but overall it was, a cool goth rock sound that I think fits in well, and you can still listen to it today. And
yeah. All right. So I think one thing I found interesting with this album was, well, I didn't think it was interesting till after I heard your review of it, Danny, but when I started listening, I was somewhat familiar with Diary of Dreams, not this album, but I'd heard some of their earlier albums, or at least not necessarily albums. I've heard tracks from some of their earlier stuff, and I liked them, not enough that I really got into them. But like, oh yeah, this is a decent track. I can enjoy listening to it at the club, and I can dance to some of them because they are, like you said, the slower thing, and I do tend to gravitate towards slower songs when I want to dance. I'm not a high energy dancer necessarily, so I like something that gives me space to express myself rather than trying to keep up and bouncing at the beat. So that sort of music does work well for me, and I'm sure I've danced to some Diary of Dreams songs. I definitely have heard of them, but again, they were another one of those bands that I know the name, I know I've heard their music, but could I put A and B together? Not very likely. I couldn't necessarily say, oh yeah, that's a Diary of Dreams song. But I know I've heard them. I know I've enjoyed some of their tracks, and I have mostly heard, I think, their older stuff. So going into this, get to the first track, and the first track is definitely, oh yeah, okay, this is sort of recognizable, and it does feel to me like some of the earlier stuff, the very slow, dark wave electronic, little goth rock, but mostly the sort of electronic, where goth meets industrial a little bit thing. But more of the electro-industrial style, like your Skinny Puppy style of interesting beats, a lot of interesting sound design, samples, stuff like that, all kind of put together into a piece of music. So I was really enjoying that, and I was liking that first track. And then the next couple of tracks come up, and it takes a quick turn into sort of future pop territory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I have a very fraught relationship with future pop.
Okay.
I liked it a little bit at the time. When it first came out, I'm like, oh, this is kind of neat. And then it became the only thing they played at clubs for about 10 years.
Yeah.
And I got really sick of it. Mostly because I don't necessarily enjoy dancing to a straight 4-on-the-floor beat. I find that's sort of exhausting to dance to. And for the way I like to interpret dance as sort of a collaboration between the dancer and the music, where you're kind of playing off one another, both parties need to give the other person space to do their own thing. And usually when you get a quote-unquote dance song, it's basically dictating dance, 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 dance. And it doesn't, to me, it doesn't give me the space to really interpret, so I usually get off the floor. There are a handful of songs that I still will stay on, partly because of nostalgia from, when it first started. I was still new to the club, and so I have some good memories of early, Apoptygma, Berserk, and some of those early bands, some early Covenant and VNV, though when those bands started getting popular was when I was starting to get a little bit tired of it. But like Apoptygma, Assemblage 23, some of their early stuff, I still have good associations with them. B-Boy Baton, Those bands were kind of what really was part of my beginning of Goth Industrial clubbing and dancing and just experiencing the whole scene. So kind of both Butterfly Dance and especially Mankind were giving me this, are they jumping on that bandwagon? Because it was released right around that same time. I mean, they've been going since the 80s, but this was right the turn of the millennia, beginning of the noughties, when future pop was just taking over everything.
That's probably why I liked it so much, because when I was first torrenting, like when I first was getting goth music and torrenting stuff, it was all future pop, synth pop, like everything, and that's what I was getting into, and that's what I like. So that's a a soft spot for me.
Yeah, whereas that was what was annoying me with the way that the club scene was changing, because it was much more experimental with, Skinny Puppy and Wumpscut and Frontline Assembly and Einstürzende Neubauten were the industrial tracks that I was really liking and gravitating towards. And then you were still hearing a lot of the goth rock and your Dead Can Dances and Faith in the Muse and some of that world mixed with goth. So you had those Arabic influences rhythmically and all these different rhythms and styles, and then it kind of congealed into this, let's do a rave but with the lights out.
Listen to some Wumpscut after this, I think.
That works. But yeah, it moved more towards a rave techno trance thing, and I like techno and trance to listen to, but I don't like dancing to it. And so I go out to clubs to socialize and to dance. So when it was this sort of, to me, tedious 4-on-the-floor beat that doesn't make me want to dance, it was kind of, you're ruining my club experience. I still want to go out and support the scene, but I just don't like the music. I mean, it was kind of like my attitude. We've talked about it with Nocturna versus Medusas when Medusas was around still. I would go to Medusas because I appreciated the work that Jean-Luc put into it, and I appreciated the club, and I wanted to support the scene. But I rarely danced because I just didn't like what they played there, because it was like mostly the stuff, aggro tech, and at that point,
back in the
some future pop, but it was definitely
Terror
the aggro
EBM.
tech and Terror EBM and all those things, which were just the same 4/4 beat, just amped up with more distortion. So I didn't necessarily dance a lot, but I liked the social atmosphere and I liked going out there, and it was easy to find parking. So all of those were the perks.
Funny, I feel like
I got it free. Go on.
I feel like I have the opposite relationship with these genres because, as I mentioned, I'm obviously like several years younger than you. So during the 2000s, I was still a baby goth. And part of the reason I was like, I only want to listen to stuff from like the 80s and 90s is because a lot of the stuff that was new was like aggro tech, cyber goths type of stuff. And I just was like, no, I'm not into this. And I didn't really like industrial or anything. But then once I actually got older and I heard it, and like I heard a DJ playing it between bands, I was like, oh, okay, this is better in this setting. Because whereas just listening to it, I was like, this is overwhelming. I don't like this. And so, this particular album did sort of remind me of that, that Venn diagram intersection of like goth and industrial, because, that's still an argument that terminally online goths have about whether or not industrial has a place in goth. And
I mean, genre classification wise, to talk on that, it doesn't.
Right.
But when it comes to shared spaces and shared aesthetic, it's perfectly fine. And that's mostly a historical thing, because they aren't really that thematically similar, other than both of them have their roots in post-punk, of course. But thematically, they're very different. Where industrial is it tends to be more aggressive, like punk, where sorts of outward focus, projection of emotion, where goth tends to be an inward focus, depression, sadness, lament, that sort of thing is an inward focus, projection of emotion. That's kind of how I view in very broad terms.
Simplified,
Yes, very simplified, very broad terms. But that's kind of how I view the distinction, and why I have trouble with things like metal being bunched in with goth or industrial, or when someone talks about motionless and white, right? We've had that. I've seen that debate online on Cemetery Confessions, actually. And the only reason because they do deal with similar things with death and the morbidity and stuff like that. But a lot of times it's more about it's again active versus passive. It's about violence and killing versus weariness with life and suicide and depression and stuff like that. And that's kind of sort of one of my rubrics around this.
Trey.
And things get fuzzy and they're not accurate.
Trey, we cannot do this now. We're 3 hours into this episode.
But that's all I wanted to say.
I know, but I have
now
things
you
to
want to
say.
say things.
Talk
sorry,
about the
it's my
goddamn
fault.
album, Trey. We can't do this now.
We'll put a pin in it. Put a pin in it. We'll discuss it somewhere else.
Nail the coffin closed.
so-
We're moving on.
So those next two tracks really gave me that sort of future pop thing. Like, oh boy, is this just going to be that future pop album because it's that time and they're going to coast on that? Thankfully, they kind of ended there and they went more back to that sort of original sound that was more that merger of the older style of electro-industrial and early EBM along with goth rock and some of the more ethereal goth as well. That sort of spaciousness, as you were mentioning, from the ethereal side, along with the timbres of the guitar and stuff and the synths from goth rock and some of the industrial. And I also felt that we got to see, what was his name? Was it Adrian?
Yeah.
Yeah, Adrian. We got to see Adrian really lean more onto his classical training vocally and as a guitarist and a pianist. And we see that more in those later tracks rather than the more synth. We've got a drum machine and arpeggiators going, so you don't see a lot of the instrumental talent, a lot of those chops that come through the classical training. So I saw that more on the later tracks. So I actually sort of flip my appreciation to what you were expressing, Danny, whereas I was a little bit bothered by the first half.
Interesting.
I mean, I guess calling it a banger is accurate, but I tend to not like bangers because they tend to be the more, I guess, pop-oriented dancing type things. Where I tend to like the more experimental, slower, ethereal, spacey, however you want to put it, things with mood. So I tended to like the latter half. I thought the latter half redeemed the first half a little bit more for me. Where my favorite tracks were, I think Babylon was definitely one of my favorite tracks. And then the last one.
I did like the last one a lot, yeah.
Those were probably the strongest tracks for me, and a couple others on the back end of it. The first track was good, and I didn't hate the other two, and I'd heard Mankind. I definitely heard Mankind at clubs, so that one I was familiar with, and maybe part of why I had a bad taste because it tends to be played in a future pop set along with V&V and Covenant and all those bands that got overplayed for me. So that's kind of my take on it. I did like it. I liked Awakening better as far as your two albums. But I did like Diary of Dreams. I was kind of hoping more for the early Diary of Dreams that leaned more towards that sort of 80s/90s industrial mixed with goth rather than getting into the noughties industrial. But, it was also released in the noughties. So it's going to lean more towards that with the industrial flavor.
It's a reflection.
It was a good
of its
album.
era.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But I thought it was a good album.
Very cool. Wow. Well, hey, every time we do a longer episode, we get comments from people saying, I really love the longer episodes. So this one is for you, kids.
This is going to be uber popular. You're going to get your YouTube million subscribers plaque from this one.
Yeah, the 15 people who like these are really going to have to replay the episode a bunch of times. KB, thank you so much for hanging out with us for such a long time. I really appreciate it. And it was really awesome to finally get to hang out with you. Again, like I mentioned earlier on, I'm going to have links to all your social media and your YouTube channel and everything. So everybody should go check it out. Watch the YouTube videos. Check out the links on Facebook and on Tumblr and everything. So much good music out there to listen to. And KB is amazing, so you should check out everything that they're doing. Thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you.
Woo!
Greetings, I'm Azzy and you're listening to All Goth Considered with Obscura Undead. This is a brand new segment where we explore just a few of the latest singles and releases in goth, post-punk, dark wave, death rock, and related genres. And we'll get to hear what the bands themselves have to say about their art. So refill your wine glasses and let's dive into these dark waters together. Up first is post-punk wave duo Vandal Moon from Santa Cruz, California. They just released their 5th, I believe, album Queen of the Night on August 19th. Like everything we've come to expect from their sound, it's filled with catchy hooks, dreamy guitars, and synth beats to die for. Their leading single for the release, Sweet Disaster, is a new goth wave dance floor staple. Let's hear from Vandal Moon.
When I made this record, my goal was to put myself in the shoes of someone growing up in a world or coming of age in a world with so much input and insanity, and the world's literally falling apart around you. There's a particular lyric that stands out on this song for me. Lightning brings fire. We were all, of course, on lockdown during the initial stages of COVID. But not only that, in my hometown of Santa Cruz, California, we had a lightning storm, which we rarely, if ever, have, which started a fire in the mountains. So we were on lockdown, and our skies were just this sort of dark orange and black color. A couple of days there, it was very much nighttime at 12 noon. The sun was all but completely blocked out. It was raining ash. The air quality was horrible. And some of those lyrics found their way into the song because of that. And when you're living through stuff like that, we all have ups and downs in our lives. But it finds its way into your relationships and affects how you interact with others and the patience that you have. And I sort of took the concept of this like multi-pronged natural disaster that I was going through and applied it to the broader idea that, although we're all suffering in some form or another, at the end of the day, what really matters is how we manifest that and how we treat one another and love one another or hurt one another. So with this song, I just really wanted to encourage people ultimately just to see one another with beauty and light and treat one another well and kindly.
Next is a band that has taken the goth world by storm as one of the newest rising dark stars. Vision Video out of Athens, Georgia is making goth with a pop edge and have brought a new generation of baby bats into the fold via social media, using a dual combo of vulnerability and highly accessible tunes. The band's latest single, Beautiful Day to Die, off their upcoming October 11th release, Haunted Hours, promises no loss of magic on their sophomore album. Let's hear from Dusty about the track.
Hey there, this is Dusty Gannon from Vision Video, and I'm here to talk about our song Beautiful Day to Die off our upcoming record, Haunted Hours. Beautiful Day to Die is a song at its core about duality and the human condition in regards to death and mortality. I wrote this song during the summer of 2021 when I was working as a paramedic and firefighter, and it was just a time where a lot of people were dying via COVID or just sort of like natural causes, and I was kind of privy to that pretty often. But I have this kind of interesting insight to it, and I often find it bizarre how death and mortality in America, at least, are often hidden. We have very negative connotations surrounding them, and I don't think we have a very healthy relationship with something that everybody will experience. So this song sort of explores the duality of that. This is something that I enjoy often in some of my favorite songs, is the sense of expressed duality, both sonically and lyrically, which I think often you'll see in bands like The Smiths and The Cure. But maybe the best example is Love Will Tear Us Apart by Joy Division, which sounds kind of upbeat and happy in the instrumentation, but lyrically is sort of emotionally devastating. And I find some of my favorite music in that sensibility. So I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you find something to commiserate and maybe ponder your own mortality with.
Didn't think we'd make it this far. If I was completely honest, putting faith into what consumes me. The ground's giving way, my heart explodes every single time I hear your words. I'll be gone tomorrow.
rounding out our exploration of the latest and greatest is Pilgrims of Yearning. I had the pleasure of hearing tracks off their upcoming EP Hadal live at Dark Spring, Boston earlier this year, and I cannot recommend them more. The lead single off the EP is the energetic yet haunting track La Mar, and it is immersive from the lyrics to the instrumentation. Jules and Claudio tell us more about the track.
Hey Obscura Undead, thank you so much for the invitation. We are Pilgrims of Yearning. I'm Jules.
This is Claudio.
And tonight we are gonna introduce the first single of our upcoming EP, Hadal, La Mar.
To me, in La Mar, the bass line and the drums are the spine of the song, are the heart of it.
Yeah, when Claudio showed me that bass line and those drums, it immediately came to my mind this image of the end of the summer, kind of nostalgic and sexy and dark at the same time, the lyrics. And all the concept of the song goes around that, La Mar, the ocean.
And even details like the guitar at the beginning of the song. I added some flanger that creates this sound that symbolizes like the wind going over the waves.
And we also brought this whole concept to the video. We thought of taking advantage of the beautiful coast of New England with all the lighthouses and the cute houses around, right? And we did it in black and white also to bring this element of nostalgia that I was talking in the beginning, right? And we also wanted to capture the sun rising in the sea, that gorgeous vision.
Yeah. And we even rented a boat for the shooting, so we had a lot of fun. We enjoyed the whole experience, and we hope you enjoyed the song as well.
You can watch the video on YouTube, and pre-sales for Hadal are already available in our Bandcamp, pilgrimsofyearning.bandcamp.com. Release day is Friday, September 2nd, when Bandcamp Friday returns. We will also be releasing some physical merch for the first time. CD copies of Hadal and Forsaken Lands will be available, as well as 2 gorgeous t-shirt designs made by some great Chilean artists. So we're super excited for all that is coming, and save the date for that. And again, thank you so much, Obscura Undead, for having us. Playing next, La Mar.
Thank you again, Azzy, for putting together that wonderful segment. And from the bottom of my heart, again, I wish you the kitschiest and campiest of Halloween seasons. Thank you, as always, to everyone who supports us over on Patreon for making this podcast possible every month. If you would like to get bonuses and perks or just support the show, you can do that by heading over to patreon.com/Cemetery Confessions. Thank you so much for everyone who has signed up and for everyone who continues to support us. We will return next month with our annual death episode. And this time we're going to be speaking with Mandy Benwalid of the website Talk Death and the YouTube channel Talk Death and the website Keeper. And we're going to be talking about a range of topics. We're going to be talking about death anxiety and green burial alternatives and the role that technology plays in modern death practices and ritual and legacy and lots of different things. So I hope you will return as Halloween draws near, as the leaves begin to change color, and if you celebrate as Samhain draws near as well, to contemplate and take a moment to consider literally the only thing we all share in common, all people, all things, all organisms, which is our mortality, our fleeting nature in this universe and on this planet. So thank you again for spending your time with everyone here at Cemetery Confessions. And until we return, stay dark.
The preceding program is a member of The Belfry, a network of blogs, podcasts, and videos for the darkly inclined. Go to thebelfry.rip for more information.